Nobody expected Earth to become relevant in the galactic arena. For centuries, we were the forgotten little planet on the edge of the Milky Way, known for its frail inhabitants and outdated technology. Our contribution to the galaxy? Almost nothing. Sure, we sent some scientists and traders out into space, but none of that really mattered. We weren't warriors. We weren't innovators. We were just there. So when a group of assassins from the elite HFY Order arrived on Earth with a proposition, people laughed. What could the most feared killers in the galaxy possibly want from us? The answer was simple: training. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday. Dan Wright, a retired Marine Corps sergeant, was lounging on his couch in a small apartment in Kansas City. He'd been out of the military for 5 years, spending most of his time working a boring security job at a local mall. Combat training was a thing of the past for him, something he did before the world stopped caring. As he watched some mindless reality TV show, his phone buzzed. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was just another spam call, but the buzzing persisted. Dan frowned and glanced at the screen. No number, no name, just a weird symbol, a circle split down the middle, with one half dark and the other light. He hesitated for a second, then picked up. Dan Wright speaking. A deep, gravelly voice responded. "We require your services." Dan furrowed his brow. "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer his question. Instead, it continued in the same monotone. "You have expertise in combat. We need you to train our warriors." Dan scoffed. "Look, buddy, if this is some kind of prank, we are not of Earth." Dan paused. He'd heard stories about alien contact before, but nothing like this. The voice wasn't robotic, nor did it have the strange, high-pitched accent you'd expect from a sci-fi movie. It just sounded powerful, unnerving. "Yeah, right," Dan said, shaking his head. "Prove it." The voice didn't hesitate. "Check your front door." Dan stood up, more out of curiosity than belief, and walked to the door. He opened it, and his heart almost stopped. Standing in the doorway was something out of a nightmare. The figure was tall, probably 7 feet, wrapped in dark, metallic armor. Its skin was a pale blue, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light of the hallway. Behind it, a sleek black ship hovered silently just a few feet above the street. No sound, no exhaust, just there. Dan stared for a long moment, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. "May we come in?" the voice from the phone asked. The figure hadn't moved its lips, but the voice was the same. Dan swallowed hard, then nodded. The alien entered his apartment without a sound. Its presence filled the small space, making Dan feel like a child in the shadow of a giant. "We are the HFY Order," the alien said, its voice still echoing from the phone in Dan's hand. "Our skills are unmatched in the galaxy. We have defeated the most dangerous species, toppled governments, and reshaped the fates of entire worlds." Dan's mouth went dry. He had heard of the HFY Order in passing from news reports about intergalactic politics. They were an elite group, known for their ruthlessness and near invincibility in combat. No one survived an encounter with them. The alien continued. "However, we have encountered difficulty." "Difficulty?" Dan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Our enemies have adapted. They have learned our methods, our tactics. They have begun to exploit our weaknesses." Dan raised an eyebrow. "And what does that have to do with me?" "We require new methods," the HFY said. "We require human methods." Dan blinked. "Human methods? You're kidding, right? Humans are nothing compared to whatever the hell you are. What could you possibly want from us?" The alien tilted its head slightly, as if considering his words. "Humans have survived despite their fragility. You have endured millennia of war, violence, and conflict. Your species is adaptable, creative. You find solutions where others see none. That is what we seek." Dan let out a short laugh. "So, let me get this straight. You want me, a retired Marine, to train your soldiers? That's insane." The ex-Handari took a step forward, its glowing eyes boring into Dan's. Insanity is often the path to victory. There was a long pause as Dan processed what was happening. He still couldn't believe this was real. The ex-Handari were asking him, of all people, for help? It didn't make sense. "I'm just one guy," Dan said finally. "I don't even know where to start." "We have identified others like you," the alien replied. "Men and women with combat experience, military training, and strategic minds. We need a team of trainers. You will lead them." Dan's head spun. This was too much. He wanted to tell the alien to get the hell out of his apartment and leave Earth alone. But a small part of him, the part that had thrived in the chaos of war, that had missed the action every day since he'd left the Marines, was intrigued. "What's in it for me?" Dan asked, crossing his arms. "Compensation will be provided," the ex-Handari said. "We possess resources far beyond anything on this planet. We can give you wealth, technology, anything you desire." Dan stared at the alien for a long moment, then shook his head. "It's not about money. If I do this, I want something bigger. You want me to train your assassins? Fine. But I want guarantees. I want protection for Earth. No more of these disappearances, no more abductions. If I help you, you leave us alone." The ex-Handari was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "Agreed." Dan exhaled slowly. "All right, I'll do it." The alien reached out its hand, and Dan shook it, the cold metal of the ex-Handari's armor sending a shiver down his spine. "Prepare yourself, Dan Wright," the alien said. "Your life is about to change." 2 weeks later, Dan found himself standing on a spaceship, not an Earth-made ship, but an alien vessel so advanced it felt like stepping into the future. The ex-Handari had provided him with everything he'd need, including a team of Earth's best fighters and strategists. They were a motley crew, retired Navy SEALs, former Army Rangers, martial arts experts, and survivalists. People who, like Dan, had been pulled out of civilian life for one last mission. As Dan surveyed his team, he felt a strange mix of pride and uncertainty. They were the best of the best, no doubt, but how could a group of humans, no matter how skilled, teach an alien race of assassins? The ex-Handari were already masters of combat. What could they possibly learn from Earth's warriors? But as the ship flew through the void of space, Dan reminded himself of one important thing: humans had always been underestimated. They were called weak, fragile, insignificant, and yet they had survived, adapted, and thrived. Maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what the ex-Handari needed. "All right, listen up," Dan said, gathering the team in the ship's training bay. "We've been hired to do a job, and it's not going to be easy. These ex-Handari, they're no joke. They're faster, stronger, and deadlier than anything we've ever seen. But they've got a problem. They're stuck in their ways. They've been using the same tactics for too long, and their enemies have figured them out." The team nodded, their faces grim but determined. "Our job," Dan continued, "is to teach them to think like us, to be unpredictable, to adapt on the fly. They've been doing things by the book for centuries, but we're going to show them how to tear up the book and write their own damn rules." One of the SEALs, a burly guy named Reyes, raised an eyebrow. "So, we're teaching them guerrilla tactics? Hit and run stuff?" Dan nodded. "Exactly. The ex-Handari are used to overwhelming their enemies with precision and force, but that doesn't always work. Sometimes you gotta get dirty, fight ugly. And that's where we come in." Reyes smirked. "Sounds like my kind of fight." Dan couldn't help but grin. Despite the insanity of the situation, a part of him was excited. This was a challenge unlike anything he'd ever faced, but it was also a chance to prove that humanity, with all its flaws and limitations, had something valuable to offer the galaxy. "All right," Dan said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get to work." The next few days were a blur of training sessions and strategy meetings. The ex-Handari assassins were terrifyingly efficient, but they lacked the flexibility that came so naturally to humans. Dan and his team drilled them on everything from hand-to-hand combat to unconventional warfare tactics. They ran simulations, pitted the ex-Handari against each other in mock battles, and even introduced them to some of Earth's more chaotic fighting styles: bar fights, street brawls, and dirty tricks. At first, the ex-Handari struggled. They were used to strict discipline and structure, and the human way of fighting, improvised, instinctual, and often reckless, confused them. But slowly, they began to adapt. They started thinking on their feet, making split-second decisions, and using their environment to their advantage. Dan stood at the edge of the training floor, arms crossed, watching the ex-Handari stumble through yet another round of guerrilla warfare drills. They were struggling, and it showed. Despite their natural agility and strength, the assassins found themselves constantly outmaneuvered by Dan's human team. Every time they tried to engage using their traditional tactics, precision strikes, perfectly calculated moves, they got clobbered by humans who fought dirty, who exploited every weakness and improvised on the fly. It was frustrating to watch. The ex-Handari weren't stupid. They were quick learners, fast to adapt physically. But when it came to throwing out their rigid combat doctrine in favor of a more chaotic, instinct-driven style, they hit a mental wall. Dan saw it in their hesitation. They didn't trust their own instincts. He called for a halt. "All right, stop." The ex-Handari assassins froze, clearly on edge. They didn't like showing weakness in front of humans, especially in training, but at this point, it couldn't be ignored. Dan walked over to the lead ex-Handari, a tall, sleek fighter named Tilak. She had been one of the most vocal opponents of this whole training arrangement, and it showed in her frustration every time they ran these exercises. "You're overthinking it, Tilak," Dan said, voice firm but calm. "You guys are trying to be perfect, and that's exactly what's getting you killed out there." Tilak's piercing, alien eyes narrowed. "Perfection is the goal. Precision is the key to victory." Dan shook his head. "Not always. Sometimes you just have to react. The moment you hesitate because you're trying to make the right move, you've already lost. You've got the physical part down. Hell, you're stronger and faster than any of us. But combat isn't just about strength or precision. It's about adaptation." Tilak frowned, obviously still skeptical. Dan stepped back and gestured toward Reyes and the other humans. "Watch them. What do you see?" Tilak's eyes tracked Reyes as he ducked, weaved, and maneuvered around the training arena. His movements weren't particularly elegant, but they were efficient. He didn't follow any set pattern. When an opening appeared, he took it, no matter how unorthodox. He fought with his whole body and mind engaged at every second, ready to change his strategy in a heartbeat. "He is unpredictable," Tilak finally admitted. "Exactly," Dan said. "Humans aren't the strongest species in the galaxy, not even close. But we've survived because we're unpredictable. We adapt. That's the edge you need." Tilak's brow furrowed as if she was processing this. The ex-Handari were a proud species, and admitting that their traditional ways weren't working wasn't easy for them. But Dan could see the wheels turning in her head. "Let's try something different," Dan suggested. "Forget everything you know about combat for a second. I want you to react. No thinking, no planning, just do." Tilak hesitated but nodded. Dan motioned for the rest of the team to reset the exercise. They cleared the floor, and Tilak took her position against Reyes, who flashed a quick grin. He loved this part of training, the chance to mess with the aliens a little. "Ready?" Dan asked. Tilak nodded, and Dan gave the signal. Reyes rushed her immediately, not giving her the time or space to prepare her usual precise counter. He threw a feint, then a jab, testing her reactions. For a moment, Tilak hesitated, her mind clearly working through options, trying to figure out the perfect response. Then something shifted. Her eyes sharpened, and instead of waiting for the perfect opening, she moved. It wasn't flawless, but it was fast and aggressive. She dodged Rey's second strike and followed up with a fluid, almost instinctive counterpunch that caught Reyes off guard. Reyes stumbled back, rubbing his jaw with a grin. "There you go," he said. Tilak looked down at her hands, as if surprised by her own actions. Dan clapped once. That's what I'm talking about. You didn't stop to think. You just acted. Tilak's expression remained neutral, but Dan could see the gears turning in her mind. This was the first real breakthrough they'd had, and it felt like a step in the right direction. Now let's do it again, Dan said. And this time, keep moving. Don't stop for anything. For the next few hours, they ran through more drills. Dan and his team took turns sparring with the Xandari, pushing them to fight in ways they weren't used to. Slowly but surely, the assassins started to loosen up. They stopped focusing so much on perfection and precision and began to lean into their instincts. They became faster, more fluid, and most importantly, less predictable. Dan watched with a sense of pride. He hadn't been sure this would work, but now he could see the results. The Xandari were learning, and they were adapting in ways that might actually give them the edge they needed. At the end of the session, Tilak approached Dan, her posture slightly more relaxed than usual. "You were right," she said, her voice begrudging but respectful. "Your methods, they have merit." Dan smirked. "Told you." Tilak's eyes flicked to Reyes, who was drinking water from a bottle, his muscles glistening with sweat. "Your team is formidable," she admitted. "Perhaps more than we first assumed." Dan nodded. "We're not the biggest or the strongest, but we've been fighting for survival since the beginning. That's why we're still here." Tilak considered this, her eyes distant for a moment. "Survival through adaptation," she murmured. Dan crossed his arms. "That's the key. The galaxy changes, the enemies change, and we have to change with it." Tilak nodded, and for the first time, Dan saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. She wasn't just hearing the words, she was internalizing them. This was more than just a training session for her. This was the beginning of a new way of thinking for the Xandari. The following days were a blur of progress. The Xandari warriors adapted quickly, pushing themselves to break free from their rigid training doctrines. Dan's team introduced them to all kinds of unpredictable, Earth-style combat methods, everything from urban warfare tactics to ambush scenarios and even dirty tricks. They fought in close quarters, simulated chaotic environments, and used every available resource as a weapon. It wasn't just physical training, either. Dan had them work on strategy, too. They spent hours running through war games, simulations that forced the Xandari to think on their feet and improvise instead of relying on pre-planned maneuvers. Slowly but surely, the assassins began to embrace this new way of fighting. Dan watched with a mix of pride and amazement as the Xandari evolved. They were still fearsome and precise, but now they had something more, an edge that made them even more dangerous. "All right," Dan said, gathering the team and the Xandari after a particularly grueling session. "I think we're getting somewhere. You guys are starting to get the hang of it." Reyes, leaning against a wall, wiped sweat from his face. "Hell, they're getting better than us at this point." Tilak stepped forward, her posture confident. "We have learned much from your methods, Dan. Right. You and your team have given us new tools to fight our enemies." Dan nodded. "Good. But don't get cocky. This is just the beginning." Tilak tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Dan folded his arms. "Combat's not just about how well you fight or how unpredictable you are. It's about knowing when to fight and when not to. You're used to being the best, the top dogs in the galaxy. But now that your enemies are catching up, you have to think strategically. Pick your battles. Know when to strike and when to pull back." Tilak's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You are saying we must adapt not only in battle, but in how we approach conflict itself." "Exactly," Dan said. "You can't win every fight, and you shouldn't try to. Sometimes the smartest move is to walk away, regroup, and come back stronger. That's the real edge humans have. We're survivors because we don't just fight, we think." There was a long silence as the Xandari processed his words. They were a proud species, and admitting that there were battles they couldn't win wasn't easy. But Dan could see that they were starting to understand the bigger picture. Finally, Tilak nodded. "You are wise, Dan. Right. We will take your lessons to heart." Dan grinned. "Good. Now let's keep training." As the weeks passed, Dan and his team continued to push the Xandari harder, testing their limits and forcing them to think outside the box. The assassins grew more skilled, more adaptable, and more unpredictable. They weren't just elite warriors anymore. They were evolving into something more dangerous, more versatile. And as Dan watched them sparring, running through drills and simulations, he realized that this wasn't just about teaching the Xandari new tactics. It was about changing their mindset, helping them understand that survival in the galaxy wasn't just about strength or precision. It was about adaptability, about being willing to evolve when the situation called for it. By the end of the training program, the Xandari were no longer the rigid, by-the-book fighters they had been when they first arrived. They had become something else, something deadlier, something that could truly give their enemies nightmares. And as Dan looked at the team he had trained, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Earth's so-called weaklings had just taught the galaxy's deadliest assassins a lesson they would never forget. Dan and his team had been grinding away for weeks, drilling the Xandari into shape, and while they had made significant progress, something still felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a nagging sense that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Sure, the Xandari had become more unpredictable, more dangerous, but something about the way they moved, the way they thought during combat, wasn't quite there yet. They were following human techniques, but they hadn't fully absorbed the why behind those techniques. After a particularly exhausting session, Dan sat down with Reyes, feeling the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. "We've pushed them hard, man," Dan said, wiping the sweat from his face. "They're learning, but I feel like they're still playing catch-up with us. We've given them the tools, but not the full picture." Reyes nodded, downing a bottle of water. "Yeah, they're mimicking the moves, but they're not fighting like us. It's like they're trying to fit human chaos into their structured world. It doesn't work that way." Dan tapped his fingers against the table, staring into the middle distance. "They're treating it like a formula, like if they follow our moves, they'll get the same results. But that's not how we operate. We don't just fight dirty, we fight smart. We adjust mid-battle, not because we're taught to, but because it's instinct." Reyes leaned back, resting his hands behind his head. "So, how do we get them to think like that? To stop trying to mimic us and actually start being unpredictable?" Dan considered that. It wasn't about just teaching techniques anymore, it was about teaching mindset. The Xandari were still rooted in the idea that fighting was about being perfect, about executing the right move at the right time. But humans, especially in combat, thrived on the ability to think in the moment, to improvise when things went sideways. "Let's strip it back," Dan finally said. "We've been too focused on showing them the how. Maybe it's time we show them the why." The next day, Dan gathered the Xandari in the middle of the training floor. His team stood behind him, looking serious. This was going to be a different kind of day. No drills, no simulations, just raw, unfiltered experience. "All right," Dan started, pacing back and forth. "We've been running you through all kinds of drills, dirty fighting, street brawls, guerrilla tactics. You've learned how to dodge, how to take advantage of openings, how to make decisions on the fly. But what you're still missing is the mindset. You're treating this like a puzzle, like a set of moves you can master." The Xandari warriors stood silently, listening intently. Tilak was at the front, her sharp eyes following Dan's every move. "We humans," Dan continued, "aren't predictable because we don't follow any one pattern. Sure, we have techniques, but the moment we stick to one, we're dead. You've been trying to do what we do, but on your terms. That's not going to work. You need to unlearn your reliance on precision." He looked at Reyes, who stepped forward. "We're going to throw you into a completely chaotic scenario. No rules, no training wheels, and we're not going to give you a plan. You're going to have to figure it out as you go." Tilak raised a hand. "What are the parameters of this exercise?" Dan shook his head. "That's the thing. There aren't any. You're going in blind." There was a murmur of discomfort among the Xandari. They weren't used to this. Dan could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. But that was the point. "Let's get started," Dan said, stepping aside to reveal a doorway to a section of the facility they hadn't used yet. Beyond the door, there was no neat training arena, no well-defined space to fight in. It was an old, industrial section, abandoned, filled with debris, narrow corridors, and low-light conditions. It was as far from the structured training grounds as you could get. Dan led the group inside. As they moved through the dimly lit corridors, the ex-Handari's posture grew more rigid, their instincts screaming that this wasn't the controlled environment they were used to. "You're going to split into 2 groups," Dan instructed. "One team will defend, one will attack. The goal isn't to follow a plan or stick to specific tactics. It's survival. Use whatever you have, improvise, adapt. The attackers need to find their way through this maze and take out the defenders, but there's no one right way to do it. You'll need to react to whatever's thrown at you. No more trying to perfect each move. Just survive." Tilak and her team took the position of defenders, while the other half, led by another ex-Handari named Geral, prepared to attack. Dan gave the signal, and the teams disappeared into the labyrinth. It wasn't long before the sounds of clashing echoed through the abandoned corridors. Dan and his team followed at a distance, observing without interfering. The first thing they noticed was that the ex-Handari attackers were still moving with their usual precision, checking corners methodically, moving in perfect formation. Meanwhile, Tilak's defenders had chosen a predictable bottleneck to defend, clearly expecting a head-on engagement. "This isn't going to work," Reyes muttered. Dan agreed. The attackers would either overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers or fall apart when the situation got more complicated. But then, something interesting happened. Geral, the leader of the attackers, broke off from his team. He stopped following the pre-established route and started moving through the side passages, ducking through debris and using the environment to his advantage. The rest of the attackers hesitated, unsure if they should follow him or stick to the plan. That was the moment everything shifted. Tilak's defenders had set up a rigid perimeter, expecting an organized assault. But when Geral came at them from the side, they didn't know how to react. Tilak quickly barked orders, but it was too late. Geral had already disrupted their formation. The rest of his team, seeing his success, scattered and started doing the same, improvising, using the environment, taking risks. Tilak's team, to their credit, tried to hold the line, but it was obvious they weren't used to this kind of pressure. Their formation broke, and in the ensuing chaos, Geral's attackers overwhelmed them. The whole exercise was over in minutes. Dan called them all back to the central area. "That," Dan said, pointing at Geral, "is exactly what I'm talking about. He didn't wait for orders or try to execute some perfect plan. He saw an opportunity and took it. That's what you all need to be doing." Geral looked proud, but also a little confused. "I acted because there was no other option. The plan wasn't working." "Exactly," Dan said. "That's what I've been trying to get across. Combat is messy. It's never going to go how you think it will. You have to be willing to change your approach the second it stops working." Tilak stepped forward, her expression serious. "We failed because we were too rigid. We expected the attack to come in a certain way, and when it didn't, we couldn't adapt fast enough." Dan nodded. "Right. But this isn't a failure, Tilak. This is part of the process. You're learning that you can't control everything in a fight. Sometimes you just have to roll with the punches." Reyes chimed in. "It's not about being perfect. It's about surviving and winning. If you can do that, it doesn't matter how messy it looks." Tilak was silent for a moment, clearly deep in thought. Then she turned to her team. "We need to train more like this. We need to learn to be flexible, to stop trying to force a plan when the situation changes." Dan grinned. "Now you're getting it." Over the next few weeks, the training became even more intense. The ex-Handari started to embrace the chaos. They no longer waited for perfect openings. They created them. They began using their environment, thinking on their feet, and even pushing themselves to fight in unpredictable ways. Dan's team pushed them harder and harder, throwing curveballs in every exercise, forcing the assassins to adapt to an ever-changing battlefield. And slowly, but surely, they got better. The ex-Handari warriors weren't just mimicking human techniques anymore. They were making them their own. They stopped hesitating, stopped waiting for the perfect moment. Instead, they acted on instinct, trusting themselves to adapt when things went sideways. By the time the final week of training rolled around, the ex-Handari had transformed into a different kind of force. They were still precise and deadly, but now they had something more. They were unpredictable, adaptive, and, most importantly, dangerous in ways their enemies wouldn't see coming. Dan stood at the edge of the training ground, watching as Tilak and her team ran through their final drills. They moved like a unit, but with the kind of fluidity and unpredictability that Dan had been hoping to see since the beginning. "They're ready," Reyes said, standing beside him. "And I gotta admit, they're pretty damn scary now." Dan smiled. "Yeah, they've come a long way." Tilak approached, sweat pouring down her face, but a look of fierce determination in her eyes. "We owe you much, Dan. Your team has given us what we needed. We are ready." Dan nodded. "You were always deadly. We just gave you the tools to be even more dangerous. Now go show the galaxy what Earth's weaklings taught you." Tilak bowed her head in respect. "We will not forget what we have learned here." Dan watched as the ex-Handari assassins filed out of the training facility, ready to return to their world and ready to change it. As the ex-Handari prepared to depart, Dan and Reyes stood by the training facility's exit, exchanging glances filled with a mix of pride and apprehension. The assassins were no longer the rigid warriors they had been at the start of their training. They had evolved into a force that was unpredictable and resourceful. But as with any rapid transformation, there was a lingering question: how would they perform in the field? The two Earth trainers received a message from the ex-Handari command a few days later. It was a short briefing, but it sent chills through Dan. The ex-Handari had been tasked with a high-stakes mission to infiltrate a heavily fortified enemy base and extract a scientist who had information vital to their people. This wasn't just a training exercise, it was the real deal. Dan felt a mix of pride and anxiety. They've trained hard, but are they ready for this? It's one thing to train in a controlled environment and another to face real danger, he said. Reyes crossed his arms. "We've seen what they can do. They've come a long way. But this is different. They'll be up against seasoned fighters, not just training dummies." Dan nodded. "We've prepared them for chaos, but I worry about their judgment under pressure. What if they slip back into their old habits?" Reyes shrugged. "We can't control everything. We just have to trust they'll remember what we taught them." A few days later, the ex-Handari assembled at their command center, ready to deploy. Dan and Reyes had been invited to watch the operation from a secure location. The atmosphere was tense. The ex-Handari warriors moved in formation, each one wearing a serious expression, their bodies a mix of anticipation and adrenaline. Tilak stepped forward, addressing her team. "Remember what we learned. This mission is about adapting. We may not have the advantage of numbers or technology, but we have each other and the skills we've developed. Trust in that." Dan could see her confidence affecting the team. They nodded, their posture straightening as if they were rallying together for a final stand. "Stay sharp," Dan said quietly to Reyes as they settled into their observation post. "They'll need to think on their feet." The mission commenced, and they watched as the ex-Handari deployed from their ship, moving stealthily toward the enemy base. The terrain was rough, rocky, and littered with debris. Dan felt a surge of pride as they navigated the landscape, keeping low and avoiding detection. The first obstacle appeared within minutes, a perimeter of armed guards patrolling the area. Dan leaned closer to the screen, his heart racing. How will they handle this? Tilak motioned for her team to stop. They huddled, whispering among themselves. After a few moments, Jeral stepped forward, gesturing toward a series of nearby crates. He signaled for the team to spread out, taking positions behind the cover. Here we go, Dan murmured, hoping they'd make the right call. With quick movements, J-Ral led a diversion. He threw a small stone toward a distant section of the perimeter. The guards, alerted by the sound, moved to investigate. The ex-Handari seized the opportunity, darting forward like shadows, slipping past the guards undetected. Dan's heart raced as they crossed the perimeter. That's it. Use the environment. But just as they thought they were in the clear, a guard turned back, catching sight of one of the ex-Handari. The alarm blared through the base, red lights flashing overhead. Now they'll know we're here, Reyes said, his voice tense. This is where it gets tricky. The ex-Handari wasted no time. They fell into formation, but it was different this time. Instead of sticking to a rigid strategy, they adapted quickly. Tilak barked commands as they split into smaller groups, using the chaos to their advantage. Focus on your training, Dan urged, his eyes glued to the screen. Trust your instincts. The ex-Handari engaged the guards, their movements fluid and unpredictable. Tilak fought with a ferocity that Dan hadn't seen before. She tackled one guard, disarming him with a swift motion and using his weapon against another. Reyes watched in awe. They're really doing it. They're thinking on their feet, Dan said, nodding. They've embraced the chaos. But in the heat of the moment, a miscalculation was made. J-Ral, thinking quickly, tried to flank a group of guards. He led a small team around a corner, but found himself surrounded. They were quickly overwhelmed. Dan clenched his fists as he watched helplessly. No, he shouted, feeling the weight of their training on his shoulders. Tilak noticed J-Ral's situation. She rallied her team, leading a rescue effort. They moved with a renewed sense of urgency, but they were heavily outnumbered now. Come on, ex-Handari, Dan shouted. You can't give up. The ex-Handari pushed back, using every skill they had honed over the past weeks. They fought with a mix of strategy and raw determination. Tilak fought her way to J-Ral, grabbing him just as he was about to go down. Stay close, she shouted, pulling him away from the fray. They fell back together, regrouping with the rest of the team. Dan breathed a sigh of relief, but the danger wasn't over yet. They had to get to the scientist before it was too late. The guards were becoming more organized, and the base's alarms were blaring. They need to hurry, Reyes said, his eyes darting around the screen. Time is running out. Tilak rallied her team again. We have to keep moving. The scientist is deeper in the facility. We'll take a side corridor to avoid more guards. Dan was impressed with her decision-making. She was adapting to the situation, thinking ahead. They navigated through the dimly lit corridors, ducking into shadows whenever they spotted guards. Just keep it together, Dan urged quietly. Trust your training. As they approached the lab where the scientist was held, they could hear voices echoing from within. Tilak signaled for silence, and the team crouched down, listening. Not much time left, one guard said. We need to get the data and eliminate the threat. Agreed. If we can't hold the base, we'll have to destroy everything, another replied. Dan's heart sank. They're going to destroy the scientist and the information. We need to act. Tilak nodded, signaling her team to prepare for an assault. They would have to breach the lab and secure the scientist before it was too late. Dan could feel the tension in the air as they steeled themselves for the confrontation. The ex-Handari launched their attack. Tilak led the charge, kicking the door open and rushing in. The guards barely had time to react. The team flowed into the room, chaos erupting as they fought against the enemy. Dan watched, his heart pounding. The ex-Handari fought with everything they had, but the guards were numerous, and the room was cramped. Tilak took down one guard, but another was quick to retaliate, throwing her off balance. Focus, Tilak, Dan shouted, feeling the weight of their training on his shoulders. You can't lose this. With a surge of adrenaline, Tilak regained her footing, ducking under a punch and countering with a swift kick that sent the guards sprawling. She rallied her team, and they pushed forward, but the guards were relentless. Suddenly, Dan spotted something unexpected. J-Ral, who had been struggling earlier, now fought with renewed determination. He darted behind a guard, using a chokehold to bring him down. The ex-Handari were adapting, learning to think independently in the heat of battle. "That's it, that's how you do it," Dan encouraged, watching as the ex-Handari began to overwhelm the guards, utilizing their skills to their advantage. Finally, they managed to subdue the remaining guards, but the clock was still ticking. Tilak rushed to the scientist, who was bound and scared. "We're here to help you. Stay close," she said, cutting his bindings. As they exited the lab, alarms blared, signaling that reinforcements were on the way. "We have to move. This way," Tilak shouted, leading the team back through the maze of corridors. But just as they thought they were in the clear, another wave of guards appeared at the end of the hallway, blocking their exit. Dan could see the tension in Tilak's eyes as she assessed the situation. "Stay low," she commanded, and they took cover behind a nearby wall. "This isn't good," Reyes said, watching the guards spread out to search for them. "We need a distraction." Dan's mind raced. "What if we use the environment again? There are crates nearby. We can create a diversion." Tilak nodded, her face resolute. "We can't let them corner us." As they quietly moved into position, Tilak gave the signal. J-Ral and another warrior began pushing over the crates, causing a loud crash that echoed through the corridor. The guards turned to investigate, giving Tilak and her team the chance to slip past. "Now, move," she shouted, and they darted through the opening, hearts racing as they ran for their ship. The chase was on. Dan's eyes were glued to the screen as they sprinted down the hallway, guards shouting and firing behind them. "Keep going. You're almost there," Dan urged, feeling the adrenaline pulse through him. Just as they reached the docking bay, Tilak turned back to face the pursuing guards. "Get to the ship. I'll cover you." "No," Dan shouted, his heart racing. "You can't stay behind." Tilak met his gaze, determination in her eyes. "We can't leave anyone behind. Go." The rest of the team rushed to the ship, but Dan couldn't tear his eyes away from Tilak. She was ready to face the guards, her posture fierce and unwavering. "Go," she repeated. Finally, Reyes grabbed Dan's arm, pulling him back. "We have to trust them. They'll find a way." As the last of the team boarded the ship, Tilak launched into the fray, her movements precise and powerful. She fought with everything she had, giving her team the time they needed to escape. "Come on, Tilak, get on the ship," Dan shouted, panic rising in his chest. Just as it seemed like all hope was lost, Tilak made a break for it, sprinting toward the ship as the guards closed in. Dan held his breath as she jumped aboard, and Reyes slammed the hatch shut just in time. "Go, get us out of here," Tilak shouted, breathless but triumphant. The ship launched into the air, leaving the chaos of the base behind. Dan leaned back in his seat, heart racing as they cleared the atmosphere. They had done it. They had escaped. As they flew into the unknown, Dan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The ex-Handari had faced their first real challenge and emerged victorious. They had adapted and learned to rely on each other, proving that Earth's weaklings could train the galaxy's fiercest assassins. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers. They would have to continue to grow, learn, and fight. The real test of their training was yet to come. The ship shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere, heading toward the ex-Handari home base. Inside, the tension began to fade, replaced by a sense of relief. Tilak paced the small cockpit, her expression a mix of triumph and concern. Dan sat at the controls, watching the stars streak by, his heart still racing from the chaos they had just escaped. "Well, we made it out," Reyes said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "But at what cost?" Tilak turned to them, her jaw set. "We lost time. We need to regroup and prepare for the next phase of our mission. Dan nodded, recognizing the seriousness in her tone. They had successfully rescued the scientist, but they were far from safe. The Xandari had made powerful enemies, and Dan could feel the weight of that reality settling in. "We need to debrief," Dan said, glancing at the navigation screen. "Get the scientist on board and see what information he has." Tilak gestured for the scientist to sit. "We need to know what we're dealing with. Every detail could be critical." The scientist, an older Xandari named Fkel, nodded eagerly. His tentacles quivered with nervous energy. "I have important information regarding the enemy's weapon capabilities and their plans for expansion. But we must act quickly." "What do you mean?" Reyes asked, leaning forward. Fkel took a deep breath. "They have a new weapon, something they're developing to counter our abilities. If we don't disrupt their progress, they'll gain a significant advantage." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of weapon?" Fkel tapped a holographic display, revealing schematics of a massive device. "This is their prototype. It's designed to neutralize our combat skills, rendering us ineffective in battle." "Why weren't we informed earlier?" Tilak snapped, frustration boiling over. "I was under constant surveillance," Fkel explained. "They wanted to keep me from escaping. I had to bide my time." Dan rubbed his temples, trying to process the new information. "So, we need to sabotage this weapon before it's operational. But how?" Tilak squared her shoulders. "We need to go back, find their base and gather intel. It won't be easy." Reyes sighed. "We just escaped from there. They're probably on high alert now." "I know," Tilak said, her voice steady. "But we have no choice. We can't let them get ahead of us. We'll need to formulate a new plan." As they flew, Dan felt the weight of their situation. They had barely managed to survive the last encounter. The idea of going back filled him with dread, but there was no alternative. The stakes were too high. The ship finally docked at the Xandari base. They stepped off, greeted by a flurry of activity. Xandari warriors were preparing for the next mission, checking gear and weapons. Tilak took charge, rallying her team. "Listen up. We've gathered intel on the enemy's weapon. We need a plan to sabotage it before it becomes operational. Gather your gear and be ready to move in an hour." Dan watched as the Xandari rallied around Tilak, their eyes filled with determination. This was different from before. They were no longer the rigid warriors he had first met. They had become a cohesive unit, ready to tackle whatever came next. Reyes approached Dan, his expression serious. "You think they're really ready for this?" "I hope so," Dan replied. "They've learned a lot, but this is a whole new level. They'll need to trust their instincts and each other." Reyes nodded. "We can't go in guns blazing this time. We need to be stealthy, precise. The enemy will be waiting for us." "I know," Dan said, steeling himself. "But if we can get close to that weapon, we have a chance." The hour passed quickly as they prepared. The team gathered in the war room, where Tilak laid out the plan. "We'll split into two groups. One will create a diversion while the other infiltrates the facility. We need to reach the weapons control room and disable it." Dan listened intently, mentally rehearsing the steps. "What's our escape plan?" Tilak met his gaze. "We'll have to improvise, but we'll do what we can to create an opening." As they reviewed the plan, Dan felt a surge of nervous energy. The stakes were high, and the mission would test everything they had learned. He glanced at the Xandari, each one focused and ready. They had come a long way, and he hoped it would be enough. With everything set, they boarded the ship once more, the atmosphere inside charged with anticipation. Dan took the controls, navigating them toward the enemy base. The stars whizzed past, each moment intensifying the sense of urgency. As they approached the base, the ship's sensors pinged with alerts. "They're on high alert," Reyes said, studying the readouts. "We need to be careful." Tilak nodded. "Stay low and keep quiet. Follow my lead." Dan flew the ship in low, landing just outside the perimeter. They disembarked, moving in silence through the shadows. The base loomed ahead, fortified and guarded. Dan felt the tension in the air as they crept closer. "Stick to the plan," Tilak whispered, her eyes scanning for movement. "We go in quick and quiet." They split into their two groups, Tilak leading the infiltration team, while Dan and Reyes moved toward the designated diversion point. The tension was palpable as they navigated the terrain, staying out of sight. As they approached their target, Dan's heart raced. He glanced back at Reyes. "Ready?" Reyes nodded, gripping his weapon tightly. "Let's do this." With a deep breath, they made their move. Dan activated a small explosive device, causing a loud bang that echoed through the night. The guards rushed toward the noise, leaving their post unguarded. "Now," Dan shouted, and they dashed toward the facility. They slipped inside, the cool air of the interior contrasting with the heat outside. The halls were dimly lit, and the sound of distant alarms echoed ominously. "Where to now?" Reyes asked, glancing around. "We need to find the control room," Dan said, scanning the layout on his wrist communicator. "It should be down this corridor." They moved cautiously, staying low and alert. As they approached the control room, Dan felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. They were close. But just as they rounded a corner, they encountered a group of guards. Dan froze, heart pounding. "Back. We need to find another way," he hissed, retreating down the hallway. "Which way?" Reyes asked, urgency creeping into his voice. Dan scanned the area. "There, the maintenance shaft," he pointed to a narrow opening just a few feet away. They rushed inside, squeezing through the tight space. Inside the shaft, Dan and Reyes crawled quietly, hoping to avoid detection. The confined space felt stifling, but they pressed on. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached a vent that opened into the control room. Dan peered through the grate, spotting the weapons control panel across the room. "This is it," he whispered, glancing at Reyes. "We need to disable it." Reyes nodded. "But how? There are too many guards." Dan considered their options. "We create a diversion. If we can distract them long enough, we might get to the panel." "Okay, let's do it," Reyes agreed. They carefully maneuvered the vent grate, slipping it off silently. They dropped into the control room, landing softly. "Now," Dan said, and they quickly made their way to the control panel, keeping low. Just as they reached it, the guards noticed something was wrong. A shout echoed through the room, and Dan's heart raced. "Get to the panel," he urged, focusing on the controls. Reyes began working on the panel, quickly scanning the layout. "I need a minute." Dan turned, weapon raised, watching the door. "Hurry, we don't have much time." The guards moved closer, their voices growing louder. "Check the vents." Reyes cursed under his breath. "I'm almost there." Just then, Tilak's voice crackled over the comms. "We've engaged. Hold your position." Dan's heart sank. "Tilak, we can't hold out much longer. We need backup." "Stay focused," she replied, urgency in her tone. "We'll be there as soon as we can." Reyes continued to work on the panel, his fingers flying across the controls. "I think I can disable the weapon, just need a bit more time." The guards were closing in, their footsteps echoing ominously. Dan took a deep breath, preparing himself for the confrontation. "We'll hold them off." "Got it," Reyes shouted, pulling a lever. The panel lit up, and alarms blared. "We triggered the alarm," Dan shouted. "Get ready." As the guards burst through the door, Dan and Reyes took their positions, ready to fight. The ex-Handari team had to be close. With a fierce determination, Dan steadied his aim, ready to defend their position as chaos erupted around them. The sound of footsteps thundered in the corridor, and Dan braced himself, knowing this battle would determine the fate of their mission and the balance of power in the galaxy. The guards charged into the room, weapons raised and ready to fire. Dan didn't waste a second. He fired 2 shots, hitting the first guard in the chest, dropping him instantly. Reyes ducked behind the control panel, scrambling to secure it from being reactivated. More guards poured in, and Dan realized they were vastly outnumbered. "Reyes, hurry up!" Dan shouted, taking cover behind a console as blaster shots ricocheted off the walls around them. "I'm working as fast as I can," Reyes replied, fingers moving rapidly across the control panel. "Just keep them off me for a little longer." Dan leaned out from cover and fired again, dropping another guard. But they were coming in waves, and there were more than he could take down by himself. He could feel the pressure mounting as they closed in. Tilak's voice came over the comm again. "We're coming. Hold your position." Dan gritted his teeth. He didn't have time to reply. He aimed and fired again, narrowly missing a guard who had taken cover behind some equipment. The room was a chaotic mess of gunfire and shouting, and it was clear that they couldn't hold out much longer. One of the guards tossed a grenade toward them. Dan's eyes widened. Grenade. He grabbed Reyes and pulled him away from the control panel just as the grenade went off. The explosion sent a shockwave through the room, debris flying everywhere. Dan and Reyes hit the ground hard, skidding across the floor. Dan's ears rang from the blast, but he forced himself to stand. His body ached, and his vision swam, but he shook it off. He had no choice. If they lost the control room, all their efforts would be for nothing. Reyes groaned, pulling himself up. "We can't keep doing this, man. They're gonna overwhelm us." Dan nodded, his jaw tight. He glanced around the room, trying to find something they could use to even the odds. His eyes landed on a stack of crates against the far wall. "Those crates," Dan said, pointing. "They look like they've got explosives in them. We can use them to create a barrier." Reyes' eyes followed his gaze, and he nodded. "It's risky, but it might give us the time we need." Dan rushed over to the crates, ducking under a volley of blaster fire. He pried one open and saw it was filled with detonators and high-grade explosives. He grabbed a handful and started rigging them together, his hands working quickly despite the pressure. "Cover me," Dan yelled, setting up the explosives. Reyes popped up from behind the console, firing off shots to keep the guards at bay. One of them charged at him, and Reyes managed to hit him square in the chest, dropping him mid-sprint. Dan finished rigging the explosives and tossed the makeshift bomb toward the entrance. Then he and Reyes took cover behind the control panel again. "Fire in the hole," Dan shouted, pressing the detonator. The explosion was deafening, and the shockwave rattled the entire room. Smoke and debris filled the air, and for a moment everything was silent. Dan and Reyes stayed low, waiting for the dust to settle. When the smoke cleared, they could see the result of the blast. The entrance was now blocked by a pile of rubble, and the guards that had been in the blast zone were either dead or incapacitated. Dan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "That should buy us some time." Reyes nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Good thinking, man, but we need to finish this fast." They scrambled back to the control panel. Reyes worked furiously, trying to ensure the weapon would remain disabled permanently. Dan kept his eyes on the entrance, though the rubble would hold for now. It wouldn't stop reinforcements from finding another way in, and he knew they couldn't rely on luck much longer. "Almost there," Reyes muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. Dan's heart pounded in his chest as the moments dragged on. Each second felt like an eternity, and the sounds of distant shouts and footsteps told him that more guards were on the way. Finally, Reyes slammed his hand on the panel. "Got it. The weapon's offline." Dan exhaled in relief. "Great. Now let's get out of here." They sprinted toward the exit, carefully navigating around the rubble from the explosion. Dan led the way, his senses on high alert. The hallways were eerily quiet, but Dan knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. As they reached the main corridor, they encountered a group of ex-Handari warriors led by Tilak. She was covered in soot and sweat, her eyes sharp and focused. "We got the weapon," Dan said. "It's disabled." Tilak nodded. though there was no time for congratulations. Good. Now we need to get out of here before they send reinforcements. They moved quickly through the base, their movements efficient and purposeful. They had practiced this, trained for it. The Xandari moved like a well-oiled machine, with Dan and Reyes following their lead. As they neared the exit, the sound of distant gunfire reached them. Dan knew it was only a matter of time before they were spotted. They broke into a run, their footsteps echoing off the metal floors. The exit was just ahead, but as they rounded the final corner, they were met with a wall of enemy soldiers blocking their path. "Ambush," Tilak shouted, raising her weapon. Dan reacted instantly, diving behind a stack of crates for cover. The Xandari warriors fanned out, taking up defensive positions. Blaster fire erupted from both sides, filling the corridor with the crack of energy weapons. "We're pinned," Ray shouted, ducking as a shot whizzed past his head. Dan's mind raced. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they couldn't afford to get bogged down in a firefight. He looked around, trying to find an opening, a way out. "There," Dan pointed to a maintenance hatch on the far side of the room. "We can use that to escape." Tilak glanced over, assessing the situation. "It's risky. They'll see us moving." "We don't have a choice," Dan said. "We need to go now." Tilak nodded. "All right, on my mark. Move fast." She gave the signal, and the group sprang into action. They dashed toward the hatch, firing as they went. Dan's heart pounded as he ran, the sound of blaster fire filling his ears. He could feel the heat of the shots as they zipped past him, but he didn't stop. They reached the hatch and pried it open, slipping inside one by one. Dan was the last to go, covering their retreat before diving in and slamming the hatch shut behind him. They found themselves in a narrow maintenance tunnel, the walls tight and confining. The sound of the battle outside was muffled, but they could still hear the chaos unfolding above them. "Keep moving," Tilak ordered, her voice low but urgent. They crawled through the tunnel, the space so tight that they had to move single file. Dan felt his muscles tense from the cramped quarters, but he pushed forward. There was no time to complain. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into an empty storage room. The team quickly regrouped, checking their gear and catching their breath. "We're not out of the woods yet," Tilak said, her eyes scanning the room. "But we should be able to slip out unnoticed from here." Dan nodded. "We need to move fast. They'll be looking for us." The group made their way through the base's lower levels, sticking to the shadows and avoiding detection. It was slow going, but they managed to avoid any further encounters with the enemy. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the outer perimeter. The ship was waiting for them, hidden in a small clearing just beyond the base. Dan exhaled in relief as they approached the ship. "We made it." Tilak didn't smile, but there was a look of satisfaction in her eyes. "We did, but the fight's not over yet." They boarded the ship, and Dan wasted no time getting it airborne. As they lifted off, he glanced out the window, watching as the enemy base shrank below them. The ship shook slightly as they broke through the atmosphere. Dan kept his hand steady on the controls, focusing on maintaining a smooth flight path. He glanced back at Tilak and the others, who were strapped in and catching their breath. The adrenaline from the firefight was still pulsing through him, but he knew they couldn't let their guard down yet. "Status report," Tilak ordered, her eyes sharp. Reyes was checking the ship's systems. "Shields are holding, but we've got a few dents from blaster fire. We should be fine, but we need to get out of here fast." "Agreed," Tilak said. "Let's put some distance between us and that base." Dan nodded, maneuvering the ship away from the planet's surface. He pushed the throttle, feeling the engines respond. The ship surged forward, and Dan focused on navigating through the stars. The view was stunning, but he had no time to admire it. They needed to keep moving. As they cleared the atmosphere, Dan initiated the jump to hyperspace. He flipped switches and watched the stars stretch into lines of light. The tension in the cabin eased slightly as the ship transitioned into faster-than-light travel. "Where to?" Reyes asked, looking up from his console. Tilak leaned back in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "We need to regroup and assess our next steps. I recommend heading to the nearest safe planet." Dan nodded, plotting a course for a nearby planet known for its neutrality. It wasn't far from their current location, and it should provide a safe haven for them to figure out their next move. Once they were in hyperspace, Dan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. They had made it out alive, but the weight of what they'd done pressed heavily on him. He glanced at Tilak, who was staring out the viewport, deep in thought. "Are you all right?" he asked, breaking the silence. She turned to him, her expression serious. "I'm fine, just considering our next move." "We need a plan," Reyes chimed in. "We can't just keep running." Dan nodded, understanding the need for a strategy. They had succeeded in disabling the weapon, but they had no idea how the enemy would respond. They needed to be ready for whatever came next. "Once we land, we should find a secure location to set up," Tilak suggested. "We'll need to contact our allies and gather intelligence on the enemy's movements." Dan agreed. "I can access the local comm networks from the ship. It might take some time, but I can get us the information we need." Reyes leaned forward. "And what about the Xandari? They need to know that we've struck a blow against the weapon. They'll want to regroup too." Tilak nodded. "We need to coordinate with them. The more information we can gather, the better prepared we'll be for the next encounter." They continued discussing their options, brainstorming ideas and strategies as they traveled through hyperspace. Dan felt a sense of camaraderie building among them. Despite the chaos they had just experienced, they were working as a team, focused on a common goal. The jump to the planet was smooth, and before long, Dan brought the ship out of hyperspace. He maneuvered into a low orbit, scanning the surface for a suitable landing spot. The planet was lush and green, a stark contrast to the barren landscape of the last world they'd visited. "There," he pointed at a clearing surrounded by trees. "That looks good." Tilak nodded. "Land there. We need to get off this ship and find some cover." Dan brought the ship down, carefully navigating between the trees until he touched down on solid ground. The engines were down, and they all unstrapped themselves, eager to stretch their legs. Once they disembarked, Dan surveyed the area. It was quiet, the sounds of wildlife filling the air. The planet seemed peaceful, a far cry from the chaos they'd just left behind. "Let's find a secure place to set up," Tilak said, leading the way into the trees. They moved cautiously, staying alert for any signs of danger. They found a small clearing deep in the woods, hidden from view. Tilak pointed out some sturdy trees to use as cover, and they quickly set up a perimeter. Reyes began working on the ship's comm systems, while Tilak and Dan gathered supplies from their packs. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Dan asked, glancing at Tilak. She shrugged. "It's possible, but they don't know where we are yet. We have a small advantage." Reyes joined them, holding a few tools. "I'm patching up the comms. We'll be able to reach out to our allies soon." "Good," Tilak replied, her voice firm. "We need to make contact and share what we've learned. We can't do this alone." Dan nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They had taken a significant step in their fight, but it was only the beginning. They needed to gather more support, more resources. It was clear the enemy wouldn't back down easily. As Reyes continued to work on the comm system, Dan turned his attention to the surrounding forest. The trees were tall and thick, providing plenty of cover, but they also limited visibility. He felt a nagging unease in the back of his mind. "Let's set up some lookout points," Dan suggested. "We need to know if anyone's coming." Tilak agreed, and they quickly set to work. They established a couple of vantage points in the trees, giving them a clear view of the clearing and the surrounding area. Dan climbed up into one of the trees, positioning himself to watch for any movement. From his perch, He could see the forest stretching out in all directions. It was peaceful, but the calmness felt deceptive. He knew that danger could be lurking just out of sight. He scanned the tree line, looking for any signs of life. After a few minutes, he heard a crackling sound in his earpiece. "Dan, you copy?" It was Ray's. "Copy. What's the status?" "I'm getting some static, but I think I can boost the signal. Just give me a moment." "Make it quick," Dan urged, his eyes still scanning the forest. "We need to be ready to move if we have to." "Almost there," Ray's replied, and Dan could hear the faint sound of tools clinking in the background. As he continued to watch, he saw a flash of movement on the far side of the clearing. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but then he saw it again, a figure darting between the trees. "Raise, T-Lac, we've got movement," Dan called out, his voice urgent. He climbed down quickly, his heart racing. They gathered together, and he pointed in the direction of the movement. "I saw something over there, moving fast." T-Lac nodded, her expression serious. "We need to investigate. It could be enemy scouts." They crept toward the edge of the clearing, moving as quietly as they could. Dan's senses were on high alert as they approached the tree line. He could feel the tension in the air, a palpable reminder that they were still in danger. As they reached the trees, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Dan's grip tightened around his weapon. They were close. T-Lac motioned for silence, and they all crouched low, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, and Dan's heart pounded in his chest. He peeked around the trunk of a tree and saw a figure emerge from the underbrush. It was another ex-Handari warrior, and Dan felt a rush of relief. The warrior waved, signaling that it was safe. Dan stepped out from his hiding spot, followed closely by T-Lac and Ray's. "Where did you come from?" T-Lac asked, her voice low. "We followed your ship," the warrior replied. "We received your distress signal. I came to find you." Dan felt a sense of hope rise within him. "Did you bring reinforcements?" The warrior nodded. "More are on the way. We need to move quickly. There's no telling how long it will be before the enemy realizes you're here." "Let's get to a safer location," T-Lac ordered. "Lead the way." They moved as a group, following the ex-Handari warrior deeper into the forest. Dan felt the weight of their situation beginning to lift slightly. With reinforcements arriving, they had a chance to regroup and strategize. As they navigated through the trees, Dan could hear the sounds of the forest around them, birds calling, leaves rustling in the wind. It felt strangely peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. After a short while, they reached a hidden clearing where a small group of ex-Handari warriors were waiting. They looked relieved to see T-Lac and the others. "We feared the worst," one of them said, stepping forward. "We heard you disabled the weapon, but we had no word on your safety." T-Lac straightened, her demeanor shifting into a commanding presence. "We're safe for now, but we need to gather intelligence and make a plan. The enemy won't take long to retaliate." Dan listened as T-Lac began to outline their next steps, giving orders and assigning roles to the ex-Handari warriors. He felt a sense of pride at being part of this team, even as the weight of the conflict loomed over them. They spent the next few hours organizing their supplies and gathering intelligence from the other warriors. Ray's managed to boost the comm system, allowing them to reach out to other allied factions. They shared news of their success and coordinated plans to strengthen their positions across the region. The morning sun broke through the trees, filtering light into the clearing where they had set up camp. Dan woke to the sounds of rustling leaves and soft voices. He stretched and stood, scanning the area. T-Lac was already up, going over their supplies with a few of the ex-Handari warriors. Ray's was tinkering with the comm system, his focus intense. "Morning," Dan said, joining T-Lac and the others. "Good morning, Dan," T-Lac replied, her tone businesslike. "We need to finalize our plans before the day gets too far along." Dan nodded, feeling a sense of urgency. They had gained some valuable allies, but they needed a solid strategy moving forward. What's the plan for the day? We need to gather more intelligence about the enemy's movements and secure our defenses, Tilak explained. Reyes is working on boosting our comms to reach out to more factions, and I want to send a couple of scouts to monitor the area. Reyes looked up, brushing a hand through his hair. I think I've got the signal working better now. We can reach out to some of the smaller factions nearby. They might have intel we need. Perfect, Tilak said. Let's get that done first. We'll need every bit of information we can gather. Dan felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were in the thick of it now, and each small step they took could lead to a larger victory. He walked over to Reyes, who was still fiddling with the comm system. Need any help? Dan asked. Reyes shook his head, a determined look on his face. I've got it under control, just need to run a few more tests. Why don't you check in with Tilak and see how the scouts are being chosen? Dan nodded and moved back to Tilak, who was now speaking with 2 ex-Handari warriors. What are you thinking for the scouting mission? He asked. We need warriors who are familiar with the terrain and can move quickly, Tilak said. I'm considering sending Nira and Jax. They have experience in reconnaissance and know how to avoid detection. Dan glanced at the 2 warriors. Nira had a focused look, while Jax appeared more laid back, but was alert. Sounds like a solid choice. Tilak nodded, then turned to Nira and Jax. You both will scout the area to the north. Keep a low profile and report back any enemy movements or unusual activities. Stay in communication. Nira straightened up. Understood. We'll be careful. Don't engage unless necessary, Tilak reminded them. We need information, not confrontation. As the 2 warriors prepared to leave, Dan felt a twinge of anxiety. The last thing they needed was to lose more people in the field. Be safe out there, he called after them. They disappeared into the trees, and Dan turned back to Tilak. What's our next step while we wait? We need to fortify our position here, Tilak said. Gather materials for defenses and set up lookout points. I want to be prepared in case the enemy decides to investigate. Dan got to work with the other warriors, gathering branches and logs to create makeshift barricades. They worked quickly but efficiently, knowing the importance of their task. As they constructed the barriers, Dan felt the camaraderie grow among them. Everyone was focused, united by a common goal. After an hour, Reyes called out, I've managed to get a hold of some nearby factions. I'm relaying our situation and gathering intel. Tilak walked over, curiosity piqued. What did they say? Reyes frowned as he listened to the response. They've heard rumors of increased enemy activity. Apparently, they've been mobilizing more forces, possibly preparing for an offensive. An offensive against us? Dan asked, feeling a chill. Possibly, Reyes replied, looking concerned. But they didn't have specifics. It seems like a lot of factions are on high alert. Then we need to be prepared for anything, Tilak said. Keep the channels open, Reyes. We need to stay updated. Dan went back to fortifying their defenses, his mind racing with the implications of what Reyes had reported. If the enemy was mobilizing, they had to be ready to respond. He worked alongside the other warriors, discussing strategies and possible scenarios. After a couple of hours, Nira and Jax returned, and Dan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He stepped forward, eager to hear what they had found. What did you see? Tilak asked. Nira took a breath, steadying herself. We scouted the northern area and noticed a large gathering of enemy forces. They were preparing equipment and seemed to be organizing for something big. Did they see you? Dan asked, tension creeping into his voice. No, Jax replied. We stayed hidden and moved quickly. But they were clearly mobilizing, and their numbers were larger than we expected. Tilak exchanged glances with Dan and Reyes, her expression serious. This confirms our fears. They are planning something. What should we do? Dan asked, his heart racing. We need to strengthen our defenses even more and prepare for an attack, Tilak said decisively. We don't know when they'll strike, but we can't be caught off guard." They regrouped, quickly discussing their options and rallying the warriors. Tilak organized teams to improve their defenses, while Reyes continued to communicate with other factions, trying to gather as much intelligence as possible. As they worked, Dan felt the tension in the air increase. They were on high alert, acutely aware of the looming threat. He noticed how focused everyone was, each warrior dedicated to their role in the plan. After some time, Tilak called everyone together. "Listen up. We're facing a serious threat. I want everyone to stay vigilant and be ready to defend our position. If we are attacked, we need to work together to protect our home base." Dan felt a rush of determination. This was their moment to stand together, to fight for their survival. He nodded along with the others, ready to defend what they had built. "Reyes, keep monitoring communications," Tilak ordered. "Nira and Jax, help me organize the defenses. We'll set up watch shifts, and everyone will need to be ready to move quickly." As the group dispersed, Dan felt the adrenaline kick in. This was a turning point. They had a chance to make a stand, to show that they wouldn't back down. They spent the next few hours fortifying their defenses, creating a series of barriers and lookout points. Dan climbed a tree again, keeping watch over the surrounding area. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every sound made him tense, every rustle of leaves setting his heart racing. After a while, he spotted movement in the distance. A small group of figures was making their way through the trees. He squinted, trying to make out who they were. Were they friend or foe? He quickly signaled to Tilak, who climbed up to join him. "What do you see?" she asked, her voice low. "There's a group out there, but I can't tell who they are," Dan replied, trying to stay calm. "They're moving this way." Tilak scanned the area, her expression focused. "Let's not take any chances. Get everyone ready." Dan nodded and quickly relayed the message. They moved swiftly, gathering the warriors and preparing for whatever might come next. Tilak positioned herself at the front, ready to take charge. The figures continued to approach, and Dan felt his heart race. They needed to be prepared for anything. As the group drew closer, he could make out the distinct colors of the ex-Handari uniforms. "Friends," Tilak called out, stepping forward. "Identify yourselves." The group stopped, and one of the warriors stepped forward. "We're from the nearby faction. We heard about your situation and came to assist." Dan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "You made it just in time." The additional warriors joined them, ready to help fortify their defenses. Tilak quickly filled them in on the situation, and they began working together, forming a cohesive unit. As night fell, the atmosphere became charged with anticipation. Dan sat by the fire, talking quietly with Reyes and a few of the new warriors. They shared stories of their experiences and how they had come to this point. Each story added to the feeling of unity, reinforcing their shared purpose. Tilak stepped away from the group, her eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to stay alert. The enemy could attack at any time." Dan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He knew they were in for a long night. They took shifts keeping watch, eyes straining to see through the shadows, waiting for any sign of danger. As the hours passed, the tension remained. Dan felt the fatigue settle in, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. They had come too far to let their guard down now. The night dragged on, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Dan kept his weapon ready, eyes fixed on the darkness surrounding them. He could feel the camaraderie around the fire, the shared determination to stand together. Then, just before dawn, a sudden noise broke the stillness, a sharp crack followed by distant shouting. Dan's heart raced, and he jumped to his feet. "Everyone up! They're here!" The camp erupted into action. Warriors rushed to their positions, readying their weapons and preparing to defend their home. Dan felt adrenaline surge through him, a mix of fear and resolve. Tilak stood at the center, her voice commanding. "Stay focused. We know our positions. Hold the line." As the enemy drew closer, the sounds of chaos grew louder. Dan could see shadows moving in the distance, and the tension reached its peak. They had to hold their ground. "Here they come," someone shouted. The first figures burst into view, weapons raised. Dan took a deep breath, aiming his weapon at the approaching enemies. This was it. They were about to fight for their survival. The first wave of enemy fighters charged toward them, weapons drawn. Dan fired his weapon, hitting one of the attackers. The others followed suit, the air filling with the sounds of gunfire and shouts. "Hold the line," Tilak yelled, rallying the warriors around her. Dan pushed himself forward, moving alongside the others as they defended their camp. They fought fiercely, every warrior doing their part to push back the oncoming wave. Dan felt a surge of adrenaline, focusing on the task at hand. They were fighting for their lives, for their homes. "Push them back," Ray shouted, moving alongside Dan. The two of them worked together, covering each other's backs as they fought against the advancing enemy. The battle raged on, and Dan felt the heat of combat surrounding him. He was aware of everything, the shouts of his companions, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, the taste of adrenaline in his mouth. As the enemy continued to advance, Dan could see Tilak pushing forward, her determination shining through. She was a force of nature, rallying her warriors and inspiring them to keep fighting. They held their ground, fighting as a united front. Dan could feel the pressure building, but they refused to back down. Every shot fired was a testament to their resilience. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tide began to turn. The enemy started to retreat, realizing they were outmatched. Dan felt a rush of relief wash over him as the last of the attackers fell back into the trees. "We did it," he shouted, adrenaline still coursing through him. The camp erupted into cheers as the warriors celebrated their victory. Tilak raised her weapon in triumph. "We fought together, and we won. This is just the beginning. We'll keep fighting for our home." They had defended their position, but the cost was apparent. Bodies lay scattered across the clearing, both enemy and ally. Dan felt a knot in his stomach as he remembered the faces of those he had fought beside. They had survived, but at what price? Tilak moved through the camp, checking on the warriors. Her face was set, focused on the task at hand. Dan knew she was feeling the weight of their losses, but she also needed to keep the group together. He followed her, ready to help. "Are you okay?" he asked as he caught up with her. Tilak paused, looking at him. "I will be. We did what we had to do." Her voice was steady, but he could see the strain in her eyes. "Do you want to talk about it?" Dan offered. He wanted to help, but he wasn't sure what to say. "No," Tilak replied. "Not right now. We need to focus on the next steps." She glanced around the camp. "We need to gather our wounded and assess the situation. We can mourn later." Dan nodded, understanding her need to stay focused. He followed her lead, moving to the nearest group of warriors. They were tending to the injured, applying bandages and checking for serious wounds. "Here," Dan said, kneeling beside a warrior who had taken a shot to the shoulder. "What do you need?" "We need more bandages," the warrior said, wincing as another warrior wrapped the wound. "And we need to check on the others." Dan quickly moved to gather supplies, his mind racing. They had fought hard, but now they had to deal with the consequences. He could see the determination in the eyes of those around him, a shared commitment to push through the aftermath. As they worked, Reyes joined them. "I've been checking communications," he said, his voice low. "The enemy is regrouping. We might have to be ready for another attack soon." Dan felt a chill at that. "How long do we have?" "Not sure. They're moving, but I can't pinpoint their position," Reyes replied. "We need to keep monitoring the situation." Tilak overheard them and stepped closer. "Reyes, keep the comms open. We need to gather as much intel as we can. Dan, let's finish tending to the wounded. Then we'll regroup and discuss our next steps." "Got it," Dan said, feeling the weight of responsibility. They had fought hard, but the fight wasn't over yet. As the hours passed, they tended to the wounded, stabilizing those who needed immediate attention. Dan felt a sense of urgency. Time was slipping away, and they couldn't afford to relax. Once they finished with the wounded, Tilak gathered everyone around. The mood was serious. The air felt heavy with the reality of their situation. "We've taken heavy losses, but we survived," Tilak said, looking at each of them. "Our enemy is regrouping. We need to prepare for another potential attack. We have to fortify our defenses and gather more intel." Dan felt the weight of her words. They couldn't let their guard down. "What's our plan?" he asked. "We need to set up lookout posts," Tilak said. "I want scouts positioned around the perimeter. We'll also send out small groups to gather intel on enemy movements. Rays, keep working on the comms to see if we can reach out to any allies nearby." Rays nodded, looking determined. "I'll set up a more powerful transmitter. We might be able to get a clearer signal." "Good," Tilak said. "Dan, I want you to lead one of the scouting groups. We need eyes on the enemy. Take Nira and Jax with you." Dan nodded, feeling the rush of responsibility. "We'll find out what they're planning." As the group dispersed, Dan gathered Nira and Jax. "We need to move quickly and quietly," he said, keeping his voice low. "Stay alert and watch each other's backs." They moved through the trees, sticking to the shadows. Dan felt the tension in the air, the weight of what lay ahead. They were entering unknown territory, and every step had to count. As they neared the enemy's previous position, Dan signaled for them to halt. He squatted behind a bush, peering through the leaves. In the distance, he could see the remnants of the enemy camp. It was bustling with activity, but it looked different, more organized, more focused. "Looks like they're regrouping," Nira said, crouching beside him. "What's the plan?" "We need to get closer," Dan replied, still watching. "We have to gather information on their numbers and movements." They moved slowly, staying low. Dan could hear the faint sounds of conversation and the clanking of equipment. He turned to Jax, who was watching intently. "You see anything unusual?" Jax shook his head. "Just looks like they're getting ready for something big. We need to be careful." Dan nodded, keeping his focus. They moved closer, finding a vantage point behind a large tree. From there, they could see more of the camp. The enemy was clearly preparing for something, and Dan's gut twisted at the thought. "Let's get a better look," Dan whispered, inching forward. He wanted to gather as much information as possible before heading back. As they settled into their new position, Dan spotted a group of enemy commanders discussing plans. Their gestures were animated, and Dan strained to hear. "Attack them at dawn," one of them said, voice firm. "We have the numbers. We cannot let them regroup." "Are we certain they have no more allies?" another commander replied, skepticism in his tone. "Enough of this hesitation," the first commander snapped. "We strike hard and fast. We'll take them by surprise." Dan's heart raced. They were planning to attack at dawn. They had to get this information back to Tilak. "Did you hear that?" Dan said to Nira and Jax, who were both listening intently. They nodded, wide-eyed. "We need to move," Nira said urgently. "Let's get back and warn them," Dan agreed. They turned to leave, but as they did, a twig snapped underfoot. Dan froze, adrenaline surging through him. They had to stay silent. He turned to Jax and Nira, signaling for them to hold still. "Did you hear that?" one of the enemy soldiers called out, his voice sharp. The camp went quiet, the tension palpable. "Check the perimeter," the commander ordered. "We may have intruders." Dan felt a surge of panic. They had to move. He signaled for Nira and Jax to backtrack, moving slowly and carefully. Every sound felt magnified as they crept away from the camp. "Stay low," Dan whispered, leading them back the way they had come. He could hear voices behind them, the enemy soldiers moving through the trees. The tension grew as they inched away. Dan's heart pounded in his chest, fear and urgency propelling him forward. They had to get back and warn Tilak. After what felt like an eternity, they finally broke free of the enemy's immediate area. Dan led them through the trees, heading back to their camp. The adrenaline made every step feel heavy, but they pushed through. When they reached their camp, Tilak was waiting, a look of concern etched on her face. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice sharp. "They're planning an attack at dawn," Dan said, breathless. "They're regrouping and seem more organized than before. We need to prepare." Tilak's expression hardened. "We'll need to make adjustments to our defenses. We can't let them catch us off guard again." Dan felt the weight of her words. They were on borrowed time, and every second counted. "What do we need to do?" "First, we need to alert everyone and get them into position," Tilak said. "Then we'll set up traps around the perimeter and reinforce our defenses. Every warrior must be ready to fight." Dan nodded, determination filling him. They had faced challenges before, but this felt different. This was a fight for survival, and he wouldn't let them down. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they rallied the warriors, sharing the news of the impending attack. The mood shifted from recovery to preparation, a collective determination settling in. They had fought hard, and they would fight again. They worked tirelessly, setting traps and reinforcing barriers. The air buzzed with urgency, and Dan felt the camaraderie grow stronger. They were a team, bound by their shared goal of survival. The night felt thick with anticipation. Dan lay on his bedroll, his eyes open but not quite seeing anything. He could hear the low murmurs of the warriors as they settled into their positions. Every sound amplified the tension in the air. It was hard to shake the feeling that this was a turning point. He glanced at the fire pit, now reduced to glowing embers. The warmth it provided was fading, replaced by the chill of the night. He had a lot on his mind: the information they gathered, the lives on the line, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "Can't sleep?" Nira whispered from the other side of the fire. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence. Dan turned to face her, his brow furrowing. "No, I keep thinking about the attack." "Same," Nira admitted. "But we've done everything we can. We set traps, fortified defenses, and warned everyone. We just need to hold our ground." He nodded, but the unease wouldn't leave him. "It's not just that. It's the people we're fighting for. We can't let them down." Nira sat up, her expression serious. "You're not going to let anyone down. We're all in this together. Just remember, we're stronger as a team." Dan appreciated her reassurance, but the weight of the responsibility lingered. The sun would rise soon, and they had to be ready. As dawn approached, the first hints of light broke over the horizon. The shadows stretched across the camp, and the world around them began to wake. Warriors moved with purpose, gathering weapons and preparing for the fight. Tilak emerged from her tent, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Everyone, listen up," she called out, her voice cutting through the morning air. "This is it. Remember what we fought for. Keep your focus. We defend our home today." Dan felt a rush of determination. He stood up, joining the others as they gathered around Tilak. "We're ready," he said, trying to project confidence. "Let's do this." The group murmured their agreement, and Dan felt the weight of their collective resolve. Each warrior was prepared to give everything for the fight ahead. Tilak nodded. "Positions. Remember your training. Move quickly and stay alert." They moved out to their designated positions, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Dan took a spot near the perimeter, his heart racing. He could feel the tension building as they awaited the enemy. Minutes felt like hours as the sun continued to rise. The camp was eerily quiet, and Dan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced at Nira, who was peering into the distance. "Do you see anything?" Dan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Not yet," she replied, her brow furrowed. "But it's too quiet." Just then, a distant sound broke the silence, a low rumble that grew louder. Dan's heart dropped. He turned to the others, who were now focused on the sound approaching. "Get ready," Tilak shouted. "Stay sharp." The noise intensified, and Dan's breath quickened. He could see shapes emerging through the trees, dark figures moving closer. The enemy was coming. "Here they come," Nira yelled, raising her weapon. Dan followed suit, readying himself for the onslaught. He took a deep breath, focusing on the task ahead. They had prepared, but nothing could fully prepare them for the chaos of battle. The first wave of enemy soldiers burst through the tree line, charging toward their position. Dan's instincts kicked in as he took aim, squeezing the trigger. The weapon fired, and he felt a sense of relief when he saw one of the enemies fall. "Hold the line," Tilak commanded, her voice a beacon of strength amidst the chaos. "Don't let them breach our defenses." Dan felt the ground shake beneath him as more enemies poured in. He fired again, trying to keep a steady hand. Beside him, Nira and Jax fought fiercely, each contributing to the defense. The sound of gunfire mixed with shouts and cries filled the air. Dan moved instinctively, shifting positions as he fought to protect his comrades. He could see the traps they had set going off, explosions ringing out as enemies stumbled into them. But the enemy kept coming. No matter how many fell, more surged forward, determined to break through. Dan's chest tightened as he realized the intensity of the battle. "Fall back, we need to regroup," Tilak shouted, her voice rising above the noise. Dan felt a surge of panic. They couldn't let the enemy push them back. He glanced at the others, their faces determined but strained. They were fighting for their lives, and they needed to stand firm. "Hold the line," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "We can't let them win." As he continued to fire, Dan felt a presence behind him. He turned to see Jax struggling with an enemy soldier. Without thinking, he rushed forward, delivering a swift kick that sent the soldier sprawling. "Thanks," Jax gasped, regaining his footing. "Stay sharp," Dan shouted, scanning for more threats. They fought back against the tide of enemies, pushing them back inch by inch. Dan could feel his muscles burning, exhaustion creeping in, but he refused to give up. The tide shifted as more warriors joined the fray, rallying behind Tilak's leadership. Dan could see the enemy beginning to falter, their advance stalling. "Keep pushing," Tilak urged, her voice steady amidst the chaos. "We can win this." With renewed determination, Dan joined the charge, moving forward alongside his comrades. They pushed back against the enemy, reclaiming lost ground. The battle raged on, but the tide had turned. Dan could see the enemy beginning to retreat, their formation breaking as fear spread among their ranks. "Don't let them regroup," Tilak yelled, rallying the warriors. "We can end this today." Dan fought harder, fueled by the sight of the enemy faltering. The determination of his comrades bolstered his resolve. They wouldn't let this opportunity slip away. As the last remnants of the enemy turned to flee, Dan felt a rush of adrenaline. They had held their ground, fought as one, and pushed back against the threat. The cheers of victory echoed around the camp, filling the air with relief and triumph. Dan dropped to his knees, panting heavily, his heart racing. He had fought hard, and it had paid off. He looked around at his comrades, the faces of warriors who had stood together through the chaos. They had faced danger and emerged victorious. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The thrill of fighting was slowly fading, replaced by the weight of what they had endured. Dan turned his gaze to Tilak, who was organizing a group of warriors to begin clearing the area. Her presence was a steadying force, commanding respect and authority. "Dan," she called, spotting him amid the rubble. "Get a few people together. We need to search for survivors and gather any weapons we can salvage." "Right," he replied, shaking off the haze of battle. He moved quickly, gathering a small group of warriors to follow Tilak's orders. As they worked, Dan noticed Nira kneeling by a fallen soldier. She was checking for signs of life, her expression pained. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The reality of their situation was settling in. Not everyone had made it through the fight. He approached her, crouching down beside her. "Is he?" Nira shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with sadness. "No, he didn't make it." She closed the soldier's eyes, a gesture of respect. "We need to honor them properly." Dan nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. They had fought hard, but the loss of life weighed heavily on them. "We'll make sure they're remembered," he promised. They continued their work, moving through the battlefield. It was a somber task, collecting weapons and checking for any signs of life. The sounds of the camp, the chatter and laughter that had once filled the air, were replaced by a heavy silence. Tilak's voice broke through the quiet. "Everyone, gather around." Dan joined the others, forming a circle around Tilak. She looked each warrior in the eye, her expression serious but filled with determination. "We faced a great threat today. Many of us lost friends and allies. We owe it to them to continue our fight, to ensure their sacrifice was not in vain." The group nodded, their resolve strengthening. "We will honor the fallen," Tilak continued, "and we will rebuild. This is not the end of our story." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Dan felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had fought together, bled together, and now they would heal together. As they began to prepare for the next steps, Dan spotted Jax approaching, a concerned expression on his face. "Hey, we need to talk," he said, pulling Dan aside. "What's up?" Dan asked, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "I overheard some of the others talking. They're worried about retaliation. The enemy won't just back off after this," Jax said. Dan felt a chill run down his spine. "You think they'll come back?" "Yeah, they'll regroup, and they'll want revenge. We need to fortify our defenses and prepare for another attack." Dan nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "You're right. We can't be caught off guard again." As they discussed strategies, Tilak called for a meeting with the leaders of the camp. Dan and Jax joined the group, which included Nira, Tilak, and a few other seasoned warriors. "We need to assess our defenses," Tilak began. "We've taken losses today, and we can't afford to be complacent. We need to plan for any potential threats." Nira spoke up. "I suggest we establish a watch system. We can rotate shifts to keep an eye out for any incoming forces." "That's a good idea," Tilak agreed. "We also need to repair our fortifications. The traps we set held, but we need to ensure they're functional for the next time." Dan listened closely as they laid out their plans. They discussed establishing lookout points, reinforcing barriers, and assigning specific roles to each warrior. As the meeting wrapped up, Dan felt a sense of camaraderie. They were all in this together, united by a common goal. Once the meeting concluded, Dan and Jax headed out to survey the perimeter. They walked the boundaries of their camp, checking for weaknesses. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. "Do you think we can hold them off if they come again?" Jax asked, his tone serious. Dan hesitated, weighing his words. "I think we can. We've trained for this, and we've proven ourselves. But we can't underestimate them." "Yeah, that's true," Jax replied. "We can't let our guard down." They continued their patrol, checking for any signs of danger. As they walked, Dan felt a sense of determination growing within him. They had faced adversity and come out stronger. They could do it again. Later that evening, they gathered around the fire. The mood was subdued, but there was a sense of unity among them. They shared stories of those they had lost, remembering their courage and sacrifices. Nira spoke about her mentor, a warrior who had taught her everything she knew. "He always said that true strength comes from protecting those we love," she said, her voice trembling. Dan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. They had each lost someone important that day. As the fire crackled, Tilak stood to address the group. "Tomorrow, we will begin rebuilding. We'll honor our fallen by ensuring their legacy lives on. We will not be broken." The warriors responded with murmurs of agreement, the firelight reflecting their determination. They had faced darkness, but together they would find their way back to the light. As the night wore on, Dan found himself lost in thought. They had endured so much, but they were still standing. He looked around at his comrades, feeling a sense of gratitude for their strength. Jax leaned over, breaking the silence. "You know, we're going to be okay," he said, his voice low. Dan met his gaze, searching for reassurance. "Yeah, we will. We have each other." The following day dawned with a clarity that felt almost surreal. The sun rose over the horizon, casting its warm light across the camp, illuminating the remnants of the previous day's battle. Dan stepped out of his tent, stretching his arms above his head, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The air felt crisp and fresh, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere of the day before. He glanced around, taking in the sight of his fellow warriors. Some were already busy repairing fortifications, while others scavenged for resources. Tilak was overseeing the construction of new barriers, barking orders with a confidence that inspired those around her. "Hey, Dan," Nira called out, waving him over. She was kneeling beside a stack of timber, sorting through supplies. "Can you help me with this?" "Sure," he replied, moving to her side. As he joined her, he noticed the determination in her eyes. They were all aware of the need for fortification, but today there was a different energy in the camp, an unspoken commitment to moving forward. "Do you think they'll come back?" Nira asked as they worked. Dan shrugged, picking up a heavy log. "I hope not, but we can't count on it. We need to be ready." She nodded, her expression serious. "I don't think they'll let this go easily. We took out a lot of their people." The two continued to work in silence, each lost in their thoughts. They were grateful for the distraction, but the weight of their losses lingered in the air. Dan thought of the warriors who hadn't returned. It fueled his determination to ensure their sacrifice wasn't in vain. As the morning progressed, the camp came alive with activity. Warriors set about their tasks with a renewed vigor. The smell of sweat mingled with fresh timber, creating a sense of purpose. "Gather around," Tilak called, her voice cutting through the noise. The warriors paused, turning their attention to her. "Today, we rebuild. Not just our camp, but our spirits. Each of you carries the weight of our losses, but you also carry the strength of our resolve." Dan felt a surge of pride. Tilak was a natural leader, and her words ignited a fire within them. "We will work together to reinforce our defenses and establish a perimeter. After that, we'll hold training sessions to keep our skills sharp. We are not just survivors, we are fighters." Cheers erupted among the group, their voices echoing in the crisp morning air. Dan felt the tension ease, replaced by a sense of unity and strength. They were all in this together. Once the pep talk concluded, Tilak assigned teams to various tasks. Dan found himself partnered with Jax, and they moved toward the eastern barrier, where the most damage had occurred. "Let's get this place fixed up," Jax said, cracking his knuckles. "We need to make sure no one can breach this line." Dan nodded, feeling the adrenaline begin to pump through his veins. They set to work, clearing debris and reinforcing the fence with new timber. As they worked, they chatted about their past experiences, sharing stories that made the time pass more quickly. Jax was always good for a laugh, and Dan appreciated the levity he brought. "Remember that time we snuck out of camp to explore the ruins?" Jax said, chuckling. "We thought we were being so stealthy until we set off that alarm." "Yeah, and the commander was furious," Dan replied, laughing at the memory. "But we found some great artifacts, didn't we?" "True, but it cost us a week of cleaning duty," Jack said, shaking his head. They worked hard, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, sweat began to bead on their foreheads. They took breaks to hydrate, sharing jokes and encouraging one another. The camaraderie in the camp was palpable, and Dan felt a renewed sense of hope. As the day wore on, they took stock of their progress. The eastern barrier was looking much stronger, and Dan felt a sense of accomplishment. He stepped back to admire their work when Tilak approached. "Nice job here," she said, inspecting the repairs. "It looks solid." "Thanks, Tilak," Dan replied, a grin spreading across his face. "Keep it up. We're counting on you to help train the new recruits later." Dan nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. They had recently accepted a handful of new warriors into their ranks, and he wanted to make sure they were prepared for the challenges ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the camp, the atmosphere shifted. The warriors gathered around a large fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. "Tonight, we share stories," Tilak announced, her voice strong and confident. "We honor our fallen by remembering their courage and spirit." One by one, warriors stood up to share their tales. Some spoke of their first battles, others of their mentors, and some of the bonds they had formed. Each story was a testament to the strength of their community, and Dan felt a swell of pride as he listened. When it was Dan's turn, he stood up, taking a deep breath. "I want to remember Kira," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She was a fierce warrior, always putting others before herself. She taught me the importance of loyalty and strength, and I strive to honor her memory every day." As he spoke, he could see the tears in some of his comrades' eyes, and it reminded him of the weight of their losses. "We will not forget those who fought beside us," he continued. "Their spirit lives on in us, and we owe it to them to keep fighting." The fire crackled, and silence enveloped the group for a moment, each person reflecting on their own losses. Then Tilak stood, breaking the tension. "We will remember Kira and all our fallen warriors. They will be with us as we continue this fight." The warriors echoed her sentiments, voices rising in solidarity. As the night wore on, laughter began to mix with the solemnity of their memories. Stories grew lighter, and the atmosphere shifted to one of camaraderie and hope. Dan sat back, watching his friends as they shared tales, the warmth of the fire contrasting with the cool night air. He felt a sense of gratitude for the bonds they had formed, the strength they had cultivated together. Eventually, the group began to disperse, retreating to their tents for the night. Dan lay in his sleeping bag, staring up at the stars. The weight of the day settled on him, but he felt a sense of peace. They had made progress, and they would continue to fight for one another. The next morning, Dan woke early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. He felt rested and ready to tackle the day's tasks. After a quick breakfast, he joined Tilak and the others as they prepared for the day's training sessions. "Today, we'll focus on combat skills," Tilak announced as the group gathered. "We need to ensure everyone is ready for any potential threats." Dan felt a rush of excitement. Training was one of his favorite parts of their daily routine. They broke into smaller groups, and Dan found himself leading a few of the newer recruits. "Listen up," he called, clapping his hands together. "Today, we're going to go over some basic hand-to-hand combat techniques. It's crucial that you know how to defend yourselves if things get rough." The recruits nodded, their expressions a mix of eagerness and apprehension. Dan remembered being in their shoes, feeling the weight of expectations and the desire to prove himself. "Let's start with some basic stances," he instructed, demonstrating the proper form. "You want to keep your feet shoulder-width apart and be ready to move. Remember, it's not just about strength, it's about technique." As they practiced, Dan moved among them, offering corrections and encouragement. He was impressed by their dedication and willingness to learn. They might be new, but they had the heart of warriors. After several drills, they transitioned into sparring matches. Dan paired off with one of the recruits, a tall, lanky young man named Rylan. "Ready?" Dan asked, assuming his stance. Rylan nodded, determination in his eyes. They circled each other, and Dan focused on his movements, using what he had learned from his own training. "Remember, it's about timing," Dan reminded Rylan as they exchanged blows. "Don't rush in. Wait for the right moment." Rylan lunged, and Dan sidestepped, catching him off balance. "See? Patience," he said, grinning. They continued sparring, and Dan could see Rylan's confidence growing. After a few rounds, he called for a break. "Great job, everyone," Dan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Keep practicing those techniques. They'll serve you well." As the training session continued, Dan felt a sense of pride in his role as a mentor. He was helping to shape the next generation of warriors, and it was a responsibility he took seriously. After the training ended, the warriors gathered to discuss strategies. Tilak led the meeting, focusing on their training and how to better prepare for future confrontations. "We need to ensure our recruits are not only trained, but also understand the importance of teamwork," she said, her gaze sweeping over the group. Each of you has a role to play, and you must rely on one another." Dan nodded in agreement, recalling his own experiences in battle. Trust was crucial in the heat of the moment. "We should run more drills focused on teamwork," he suggested. "Situations where they need to rely on each other will help them bond." "Good idea," Tilak replied. "We'll integrate that into our training schedule." As the meeting wrapped up, Dan felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were building something strong here, a community that could withstand any storm. Later in the afternoon, Dan joined Jax and Nera for a quick lunch. They settled on a log near the edge of the camp, enjoying the simple meal. "Think we'll see any action soon?" Jax asked, chewing on a piece of dried meat. "Honestly, I hope not," Nera replied. "But we need to stay vigilant. They won't let us off the hook easily." Dan glanced at the horizon, feeling a chill run down his spine. "We'll be ready for whatever comes. We can't let our guard down." As they finished eating, a shout broke the air, causing their heads to snap around. Tilak was waving frantically, gathering the warriors. "Everyone, quickly, we have company." Panic surged through Dan's chest as he stood up, adrenaline kicking in. They rushed toward Tilak, who was already organizing the troops. "Form a perimeter," she commanded, her voice steady despite the urgency. "We need to assess the situation. Jax, gather the scouts. I want eyes on whoever's approaching." Dan's heart raced as he moved to follow orders. The air felt charged, and he could sense the tension in the group. "Stay alert," Tilak shouted. "We don't know if they're friend or foe." The warriors took their positions, forming a defensive line. Dan could see the dust kicking up in the distance as figures approached. He squinted, trying to get a better look. Jax returned, panting. "It's a group of riders. They're coming in fast." "Get ready," Tilak said, her voice firm. "We'll need to hold our ground until we know their intentions." The warriors steadied themselves, fingers hovering over weapons. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Dan's mind raced, considering their options. As the riders drew closer, he could see their banners flapping in the wind. They bore a crest he recognized. "It's the Iron Brigade," he shouted, relief flooding through him. Tilak stepped forward, her demeanor shifting. "Let's lower our weapons. They're allies." The warriors followed her lead, and Dan felt the tension dissipate slightly. The riders approached, their leader a tall woman with a commanding presence. "Tilak," she called, dismounting her horse. "Good to see you." "Zara," Tilak exclaimed, moving to embrace her. "What brings you here?" Zara stepped back, surveying the camp. "We heard about your battle. We wanted to check in and offer our assistance." Dan felt a surge of gratitude. The Iron Brigade had always been a reliable ally. "Thank you," Tilak said. "We could use all the help we can get." As the two leaders spoke, Dan moved to join Jax and Nera. "This is great news," he said, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. "Yeah, we need all the support we can get," Jax replied, relief evident in his expression. Nera nodded, her gaze focused on the arriving riders. "They'll bolster our defenses and bring more resources." After a brief discussion, Zara and her group began to unload supplies and equipment. Dan felt a renewed sense of hope as he watched them work. "Let's get organized," Tilak called, rallying the warriors. "We need to integrate our forces and plan our next steps." With the Iron Brigade's help, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. They worked together, sharing resources and strategies. That evening, as they gathered around the fire, Dan felt a sense of camaraderie that warmed him from the inside. They shared stories and laughter, warriors from two groups united by a common goal. Zara stood to address the group. "We've faced battles together before, and we will do so again. Together, we are stronger." Cheers erupted around the fire, voices rising in agreement. Dan felt a swell of pride, knowing they were forging alliances that would serve them well. As the night wore on, Dan sat back, watching the interactions between the two groups. The Iron Brigade's arrival had rejuvenated their spirits, and it felt like they were one step closer to overcoming the challenges ahead. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The two groups worked together, combining their resources and training methods. Dan found himself collaborating with Zara on defensive strategies, learning new techniques he hadn't considered before. "Have you ever thought about setting up decoy traps?" Zara asked one afternoon as they reviewed their layout. "They can lure the enemy into a vulnerable position." Dan nodded, intrigued. "That's a solid idea. We could set up some false barriers and have warriors positioned nearby to ambush." Zara grinned, clearly pleased. "Exactly. If we can catch them off guard, it will give us the upper hand." As they brainstormed, Dan felt a sense of excitement building. They were not just preparing for the worst, they were actively strategizing for victory. Meanwhile, Nira and Jax took charge of training the recruits. The energy in the camp was infectious, and everyone seemed more focused than ever. As the days turned into a week, the bond between the two groups deepened. They shared meals, stories, and laughter, all while honing their skills for the battles that lay ahead. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of color, Dan gathered with his friends near the fire. "I can't believe how far we've come," he said, looking around at the group. "Yeah, it feels like we're finally becoming a real team," Jax replied, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. Nira nodded in agreement. "It's nice to see everyone working together." Dan took a deep breath, savoring the moment. They had faced darkness and loss, but now they were united, ready to confront whatever challenges awaited them. But that night, as they settled in for bed, an uneasy feeling crept into Dan's chest. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of activity, but something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that their enemies were still lurking, watching from the shadows. As he lay in his sleeping bag, he stared at the ceiling of his tent, unable to find rest. He glanced over at Jax, who was already asleep, the sound of his steady breathing providing some comfort. Dan closed his eyes, trying to push the unease away. They were strong, united. They could handle whatever came their way. In the early hours of the morning, Dan was jolted awake by the sound of shouting. He leapt out of his sleeping bag, heart racing. "Tilak, Zara," he called, scrambling to put on his gear. "What's happening?" He stumbled out of his tent and into chaos. Warriors were scrambling, grabbing weapons and rushing to form a line of defense. The air was thick with tension, and Dan felt his pulse quicken. "Tilak," he shouted, searching for his commander. "Dan," she replied, her voice cutting through the noise. She was directing troops, her focus unwavering. "We have incoming." Dan felt a jolt of adrenaline as he grabbed his weapon, moving to join the line. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to defend their camp. "What's the situation?" he asked Tilak as he reached her side. "Scouts reported a large force approaching from the north," she replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to hold the line." Dan nodded, gripping his weapon tightly. "What's the plan?" "We'll use the barriers we built to our advantage. Zara, I want you to coordinate with your people. We need to fortify our defenses quickly." Zara nodded, moving off to direct her warriors. Tilak turned to Dan. "You'll be with Jax and Nira on the eastern flank. Keep a lookout for any weaknesses." Dan felt a rush of determination. Understood. As they took their positions, Dan's heart raced. They had trained for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The warriors moved quickly, forming a defensive line. Dan could see the dust rising on the horizon, the enemy approaching rapidly. "Tighten up," Tilak shouted, her voice carrying over the noise. "Stay focused." Dan positioned himself next to Jax and Nira, their expressions serious. "We've got this," Jax said, clenching his fists. "Just remember what we practiced," Nira added, her eyes scanning the approaching figures. As the enemy drew closer, Dan's heart raced. He could see their banners fluttering in the wind, their numbers greater than he had anticipated. "Get ready," Tilak shouted. "Hold the line." The warriors steeled themselves, weapons at the ready. Dan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his responsibility. They were all counting on each other, and he refused to let them down. "Here they come," Jax yelled, raising his weapon. The enemy surged forward, a wave of chaos and sound. Dan felt a surge of adrenaline as the clash began, the air filled with shouts and the sound of metal against metal. He fought alongside his friends, focusing on their movements and the rhythm of the battle. They had trained for this, and now it was time to put everything they had learned into practice. The clash of weapons rang out, echoing in the chaos of battle. Dan fought with determination, his heart pounding in his chest as he engaged in combat. "Watch your left," Nira shouted, parrying a blow aimed at Dan. "Thanks," he replied, grateful for her quick reflexes. They moved together, fluid in their movements, relying on the training they had honed over the past weeks. Dan felt the energy of the group surging around him, their bond stronger than ever. But as the battle raged on, Dan realized the enemy was relentless. They pushed forward, overwhelming the line with their sheer numbers. "Fall back," Tilak shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to regroup." Dan felt a surge of fear as the warriors began to retreat. They had fought hard, but it was clear they were outmatched. "Stick together," he yelled, rallying his friends as they fell back to a more fortified position. They regrouped near the central command post, the atmosphere tense as they assessed their situation. "Tilak, we can't hold them," Zara said, breathless as she joined them. "They're overwhelming our defenses." Dan's mind raced. "We need to find a way to cut them off. If we can break their momentum." Tilak nodded, her expression fierce. "You're right. We need to push them back." They formulated a plan quickly, knowing they had little time. They would launch a counterattack, hoping to disrupt the enemy's formation and turn the tide of battle. "Let's move," Tilak shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos. Dan felt a surge of determination as they charged back into the fray. The warriors moved as one, united in purpose. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for each other. As they engaged the enemy once more, Dan's adrenaline surged. He could feel the heat of battle all around him, the clash of metal and the cries of warriors pushing him forward. "Keep pushing," he shouted, rallying his comrades. With renewed energy, they fought hard, pushing the enemy back inch by inch. Dan could see the shift in the tide as the enemy began to falter, confusion spreading among their ranks. "Now's our chance," Tilak yelled, her voice rising above the chaos. With a final surge, the warriors launched a coordinated attack, pushing back against the enemy with everything they had. Dan felt a sense of exhilaration as they fought together, their bonds solidifying in the heat of battle. They began to break through, inching closer to victory. Dan's heart raced as he fought alongside his friends, the camaraderie and shared purpose igniting a fire within him. "Forward," he shouted, leading the charge. The enemy began to retreat, their ranks breaking under the pressure. Dan felt a surge of triumph as they pressed forward, pushing them back toward the edge of the battlefield. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the enemy broke, fleeing into the distance. The warriors erupted into cheers, their voices ringing out in celebration. "Victory!" Tilak shouted, raising her weapon high. Dan felt a rush of emotion as he looked around at his comrades, their faces illuminated by the fading light of the day. They had fought together, and they had won. As the adrenaline began to fade, Dan took a deep breath, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. They had faced a formidable enemy, but they had stood strong, united in their purpose. "We did it," Jax exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. Nira hugged Dan tightly, her expression a mix of relief and joy. "I can't believe we pulled it off." Tilak moved among the warriors, her presence a beacon of strength. "Let's regroup and assess our losses. We've fought hard, but we need to ensure everyone is accounted for." Dan nodded, feeling a sense of responsibility wash over him. They had faced darkness and emerged victorious, but they couldn't forget those who had fought beside them. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted from one of celebration to reflection. They gathered around the fire once more, sharing stories of bravery and sacrifice. Dan felt a deep sense of gratitude for his comrades, the bonds they had forged in battle solidifying their community. They were not just survivors, they were a family, united in purpose and spirit. As he lay down that night, Dan closed his eyes with a sense of peace. They had faced darkness, but together they had emerged stronger than ever. Days turned into weeks, and the aftermath of the battle settled over the camp. The warriors worked tirelessly to rebuild, their spirits high after the hard-fought victory. Dan found himself reflecting on the experiences they had shared, the lessons learned in the heat of battle. He was no longer just a warrior, he was a leader, shaping the next generation of fighters. As they trained and strategized, Dan felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were preparing for whatever lay ahead, knowing that they were not alone. One afternoon, as they gathered for a meeting, Tilak addressed the group. "We've faced many challenges, but we have proven our strength. We will continue to train and prepare for anything that comes our way." Dan felt a sense of pride swell within him. They had fought hard, and now they were ready for the future. As they left the meeting, he caught up with Jax and Nira. "What's next for us?" he asked, curious about their plans. "I think we should set our sights on expanding our territory," Jax suggested. "If we can secure more land, we can fortify our defenses." Nira nodded in agreement. "It's a smart move. We need to ensure we have resources and a safe place to regroup if we need to." Dan felt excitement build within him. Let's make it happen. With their spirits high and their purpose clear, the warriors moved forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Together, they were strong, united in their determination to protect one another and build a future worth fighting for. As weeks passed, the camp transformed into a bustling hub of activity. The victory against their enemies ignited a new sense of purpose among the warriors. They worked diligently, fortifying defenses and expanding their territory, determined to build a lasting legacy for future generations. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dan gathered with Jax, Nira, and Zara around a fire. The warm glow illuminated their faces, casting flickering shadows against the trees surrounding them. "Tonight, we should discuss our next steps," Tilak said, joining the group. She leaned forward, her expression serious but determined. "We've secured our borders, but we need to ensure our strength moving forward." Dan nodded, appreciating her leadership. "I think we should focus on training the new recruits. They'll be our backbone in the future." Nira agreed. "Absolutely. The more prepared they are, the better we'll be as a unit." Zara chimed in. "And we should also explore alliances with neighboring groups. Strength in numbers will help us maintain our defenses." The conversation flowed, ideas bouncing back and forth, each member contributing their thoughts. Dan felt a surge of pride watching them collaborate. They had grown into a cohesive unit, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As night fell, Dan glanced up at the stars, feeling a sense of hope. Their future was uncertain, but they were ready to meet it head-on. The next morning, Dan and Jax led a training session for the recruits. The sun shone brightly as they demonstrated techniques, the energy among the group palpable. "Remember, teamwork is key," Jax shouted, demonstrating a defensive formation. "Stay close, communicate, and watch each other's backs." The recruits practiced diligently, their determination evident in their faces. Dan walked among them, offering guidance and encouragement. "You're doing great," he said to one young warrior, whose face showed a mixture of concentration and anxiety. "Keep your stance firm and trust your instincts." The warrior nodded, adjusting his position as Dan moved on to the next group. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he watched them grow more confident, their skills sharpening with each passing day. After the training session, Tilak approached Dan. "I want you to lead a small group to scout the neighboring territories. We need to assess potential allies and ensure our borders are secure." Dan felt a rush of excitement at the opportunity. I'd be honored. When do you want us to leave? Tomorrow morning. Take Jax and Nira with you. I want you to gather as much information as possible. Understood, Dan replied, determination coursing through him. They were taking proactive steps, building relationships that could solidify their strength. The following morning, Dan, Jax, and Nira set out early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The air was crisp, and the world around them felt alive with possibility. They traveled swiftly, navigating through familiar terrain before venturing into uncharted areas. As they trekked through the forest, Dan felt a sense of purpose guiding him. They were explorers, seeking allies in a world that had tested them time and again. We should check in with the Ridge clan first, Jax suggested, breaking the silence. They've always been friendly, and their warriors are skilled. Good idea, Nira agreed. We can gauge their readiness for an alliance. They picked up their pace, moving with purpose. As they neared the Ridge clan's territory, Dan felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Would they be welcomed? When they reached the Ridge clan's camp, they were met by a group of warriors, their expressions wary but curious. One stepped forward, a tall figure with a commanding presence. Who are you, and what brings you here? The leader asked, arms crossed. Dan stepped forward, his voice steady. I'm Dan, and these are my friends Jax and Nira. We come from the camp near the old ruins. We seek to discuss an alliance. The leader narrowed his eyes but remained silent, studying them. After a tense moment, he nodded. Very well, follow me. The trio exchanged glances, a mix of relief and caution swirling in the air. As they followed the leader into the camp, Dan took in the surroundings. The Ridge clan had built sturdy structures, their defenses impressive. Once inside, they gathered around a central fire, the atmosphere shifting as the leader introduced himself. I'm Kale. We've heard of your recent victories, but trust is earned, not given. What do you offer? Dan felt a surge of confidence. We can provide support, resources, and share our training methods. Together, we can strengthen our defenses against any threats. Jax and Nira chimed in, sharing stories of their experiences and the recent battles they had fought. The Ridge clan listened intently, the tension in the air slowly dissipating as they recognized the sincerity in their words. After a lengthy discussion, Kale leaned back, contemplating their proposal. We've been isolated for too long. If you're willing to share knowledge and resources, we could form a powerful alliance. Dan felt a wave of relief wash over him. We will work together to prepare for whatever challenges come our way. As they sealed the alliance, a sense of camaraderie formed between the two groups. They exchanged contact information, pledging to support one another. The journey back to their camp was filled with excitement. Dan couldn't help but smile as they recounted the meeting, their spirits high. We did it, Nira exclaimed. That was amazing. Yeah, the Ridge clan is going to be a valuable ally, Jax added, grinning. Dan felt a sense of accomplishment. They had taken steps to secure their future, building relationships that would fortify their defenses. Upon returning, they were met with enthusiasm from their comrades. Tilak and Zara listened intently as they recounted the successful meeting. Excellent work, Tilak praised. This alliance will strengthen us considerably. Days turned into weeks as the newly formed alliance flourished. Warriors from both camps trained together, sharing techniques and strategies, building a community that thrived on collaboration. But even in the midst of growth, Dan felt a lingering sense of unease. While they fortified their defenses, he couldn't shake the feeling that their enemies were still out there, watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. One night, as he stood guard, he spotted movement in the distance. A group of figures appeared at the edge of the woods, their silhouettes barely visible against the backdrop of the moonlight. Who goes there? Dan called out, raising his weapon. The figures hesitated, then stepped into the light. It was a group of scouts from the Ridge clan, their faces serious. Dan, we need to talk, one of them said, urgency in his tone. We spotted a large group of enemy warriors gathering nearby. They're planning to attack. Dan felt his heart drop. How many? Too many to count, the scout replied, his eyes wide. They're coming for us. Dan's mind raced. They had to act quickly. He sprinted back to the camp, gathering Tilak, Zara, Jax, and Nira. We have a situation, Dan said, his voice firm. The enemy is gathering nearby, and they're planning to attack. Tilak's expression hardened. We need to prepare our defenses immediately. We can't let them catch us off guard. They moved quickly, organizing the warriors into defensive positions. Dan felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins as they worked together, their training and camaraderie shining through. Stay sharp, Tilak shouted as they formed a perimeter. We've faced challenges before, and we will face this one together. The warriors took their positions, ready to defend their camp. Dan's heart raced as he scanned the horizon, waiting for the enemy to make their move. The air was thick with tension, and Dan could feel the energy around him buzzing with anticipation. They were ready to fight, but the uncertainty of the battle loomed overhead. Suddenly, a cry echoed from the trees, followed by the sound of pounding hooves. The enemy surged forward, a tide of warriors descending upon them. Hold the line, Tilak shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. Dan felt a rush of adrenaline as they engaged the enemy, weapons clashing and shouts ringing out. He fought alongside his comrades, the heat of battle igniting a fierce determination within him. They moved as one, a united front against the onslaught. Dan focused on his training, relying on the skills they had honed over countless drills. He fought fiercely, protecting his friends and comrades as they pushed back against the enemy. But the enemy was relentless. They surged forward, pushing against the defensive line, and Dan felt the pressure mounting. Fall back, Tilak commanded, rallying the warriors as they regrouped. Dan fought hard, determined to protect his friends. They fell back to a more fortified position, regrouping and assessing their situation. We can't let them break our lines, Zara shouted, her voice fierce. Then we need to counterattack, Jax yelled, adrenaline coursing through him. Dan nodded, adrenaline surging through his veins. We can't let them take our camp. With renewed determination, they launched a counterattack, pushing forward with everything they had. The clash of weapons echoed through the air, and Dan fought with all his might, refusing to give in. They began to push the enemy back, their teamwork shining through the chaos. Dan felt a surge of exhilaration as they fought, the bond they shared strengthening in the heat of battle. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the enemy began to falter. They retreated, confusion spreading among their ranks. Now's our chance, Tilak shouted. With a final surge, they pressed forward, pushing the enemy back. Dan felt a rush of triumph as they fought together, their bonds solidifying in the heat of battle. The enemy broke, fleeing into the night, and the warriors erupted into cheers. They had fought together, and they had won. As they regrouped, the atmosphere shifted from one of chaos to celebration. They had faced a formidable enemy and emerged victorious, their spirits soaring. But even as they celebrated, Dan felt a sense of caution. They had triumphed today, but he knew that they could face challenges again. In the days that followed, the camp began to heal from the battle. They tended to the wounded and honored those who had fought bravely. The bond between the two clans grew stronger, their shared experiences solidifying their alliance. Dan found himself reflecting on everything they had accomplished. They were no longer just survivors. They were a united force, ready to face whatever challenges came their way. As he stood on a hill overlooking the camp one evening, he felt a sense of hope wash over him. They had faced darkness together and emerged stronger, ready to build a future worth fighting for. And for the first time, Dan truly believed they would prevail.